So I see we have a full house. I'm going to call the meeting to order. Thank you if I can get everyone's attention in the room. I'm going to call the meeting to order. I'd like to thank all of you for coming back this afternoon. We now have a quorum for the meeting. The only member that's absent now is Councillor Campbell, who was unable to attend as he was undergoing some surgery today. Hopefully, he's not spending his time in hospital watching us, and he's watching something more interesting on the TV. Well, he has I believe it was a hernia. I wouldn't want it to get worse. I would like to see it get better. So hopefully he's watching something else. For those in the room with us, the screen at the back of the room provides real-time updates concerning where we are in the agenda, what's coming up next. You can follow the agenda for those that might be online as well, and the debate on your computer, tablet, or smartphone at www.toronto.ca/council. The Planning and Growth Management Committee greatly acknowledges it is meeting on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron, Wendat, and home to many diverse Indigenous peoples. As we start the meeting today, I'd also like to publicly thank Mr. Greg Lintern, who is going to be acting as our interim chief planner. There he is hiding over there. Thank you, Greg, for taking on that wonderful role. It gives you a chance to do all of your former work, because I'm sure no one will let you out of it, and all the role of the chief planner and everything else that you may get called upon to and asked to do. But we're here and wish you luck during this time, and thank you for your taking it on, and we're lucky to have you doing that. So thank you very much. Just remember the no problem. I think I heard that. It was a you're welcome, was it? Okay, well, a lot of experience here, Greg, and I'm sure we can use it. Why don't we go through the agenda, see if there's anything that we can release. We have TOcore proposed downtown plan is 22.1. Oh, sorry. Is there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Seeing none. Confirmation of the minutes, moved by Councillor Perks. All those in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none. Leaving, Ben, can I go through my agenda?
Go through the agenda.
Thank you. TOcore, we have some speakers or a speaker for that, so we're going to hold that down. Planning and age-friendly Toronto alignment of official plan policies and city planning initiatives. I'm going to hold that. PG 22.3, 721 Eastern Avenue zoning bylaw amendment and draft plan of subdivisions application preliminary report. I don't see any speakers here.
There's no motion from Councillor Fletcher.
Councillor Fletcher, does she want to come down for that still? I'll hold that briefly. If she's around, as she can let us know. If not, we'll adopt it as I have no speakers for it. PG 22.4, airport zoning regulation to protect hospital helicopter flight pass preliminary reports. I have no speakers. I have a recommendations from staff to schedule community consultation meetings and give out notice. That's moved by Councillor Ballo. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. 22.5, inclusion on the City of Toronto's Heritage Registry, Midtown and Focus Phase 1 Main Street properties. We have a number of speakers of that still that are here from this morning, so we're holding that. (22.6) status update Heritage Register and Citywide Heritage Survey. We have some speakers on that. So we're holding that. 22.7, status update electronic circulation process for potential heritage properties under review. Motion to adopt staff recommendations moved by Councillor DiCiano. Those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. 22.8, approval of the 2017 Toronto Heritage Grants Awards. We're running a little short on time today. Are there any questions on that? If not, motion to adopt the staff recommendations, moved by Councillor Perks. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. No,
It's the same.
we're fine, just moving the motion under 8. 22.9, city-initiated St. Clair Avenue study between Old Western Road and Blackthorn Avenue, Spring Grove Avenue, zoning bylaw amendment, final report.
Can you confirm we're doing the speakers for the staff?
Are there any speakers that might be here? Because I don't have any listed. Okay, so you'll have to hold on, we'll hold that. PG 22.10, City Planning Division Study Work Program Update. I would suggest, because it just came out and some of my colleagues had expressed some interest in items which they wish to see in the plan or not see there, that we defer this to the next meeting, so all of members of council have a chance to look at it, and if there's any requests that they have or changes or things that they feel aren't included, they can come back to us with it. So I move to defer this to the next meeting. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. 2211, work plan for the end-to-end review of the development review process. I'm holding that. One of my colleagues wants to come down and speak to that. PG 22.12, group home community information. This is a motion from Councillor Ainsley. Yes.
Yep.
Why'd you get the email?
Pardon me?
Why'd you get the email?
I know Mr.
I got it too. I was copied too.
Yeah,
Okay, as long as the clerk's aware of that. And is Mr. Dowling in the room?
no.
Okay, I'll hold it and I'll speak to you offline. Because I'd like our legal staff to comment on the item, because we've gone through it before. Unless you just want to have them comment on it now. And
We could probably dispose of it.
Could probably just deal with it right now.
can I,
Yes, Mr. Chair. Certainly, the item has been extensively dealt with in the past. In fact, the chronology in terms of in Mr. Dowling's email is quite accurate. So you can see that it was considered through statutory public meeting, and there was an amendment to the comprehensive bylaw with the end result that those separation distances were deleted from the bylaw.
Was
And
there
I'm not
also-
aware of any change in legislation or case law that would be relevant to committee or council's reconsideration of the matter.
because my understanding is that we can't do this. Is that in English? We cannot do what we're being asked to do by legislation.
You could say that. I think that what I would say is that
I'm going to move
what I would say is that I think after extensive planning review, it was determined that there was no planning rationale for the separation distances, and consequently, it was removed from the bylaw, and that resulted in the complainants to the Human Rights Commission withdrawing their complaint.
Okay, so I'm looking for a motion to receive this.
Sunny die.
Is that,
Sorry.
Defer, sunny die.
no, well,
Yep,
the motion is to defer sine die?
yep.
That's the motion. Are there any speakers, other speakers, movers, all in favor?
Sorry, hold on.
Oh.
Moving?
Staff, my colleagues have moved to defer it sine die. Can we do that?
Defer indefinitely.
Defer indefinitely. All those in favor? That's carried. 22.13, balancing music venues and new development.
Speakers for
I have speakers for that, so I'm going to hold that one down. Going back to the agenda, if I could ask, I have to add, there's an item that Councillor Mahevic has asked us to add to the agenda, which I'd be pleased to do, which is residential solar panel protection provisions. I'll move it to add it to the agenda. All those in favor? Opposed? Let's add it to the agenda. Back to what we have in front of us. When we broke this morning, I took the opportunity to have some of the members of the public that had an interest in the heritage listing and Representative Bill Toronto, BILD, come and speak. They've taken their time off work to try and be here and asked if it would be possible for us to deal with that item first after lunch. I think their speakers might be shorter than before. So if I could get your permission to reorder the agenda and move that item to the first item. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. So we're with 22.5. We have speakers, Mr. Switzer. So anyone who's here to speak, we have 5 minutes you can speak up to. Please speak to the item that's in front of us. I'll start the clocks, and after, if there's questions of you, we'll ask them. If not, we'll go to the next speakers, and then committee will bring it in and deal with it later.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Gary Switzer, and I'm the chair of the Toronto chapter at BUILD, also a developer, CEO of Mod Developments, which has been involved with heritage buildings for the last decade, including 5 St. Joseph, which restored half a block of Victorian stores on Yonge Street, Massey Tower across the street on Yonge Street, preserving the old Bank of Commerce building, and most recently, Waterworks, which is the site at 505 Richmond, which we bought from the City of Toronto, which also includes extensive heritage restoration and preservation. My issue with, or I should say, our association's issue and my personal issue is not with the idea of batch listings. We've been doing the first inventory of heritage properties started in 1973 when Bill Greer from the Toronto Historical Board drove around and identified buildings like St. James Cathedral, St. Lawrence Hall, Union Station. It's not a bad idea. And for years, I've personally been very frustrated, both as a citizen, an architect, and as a developer, by the loss of too many buildings that have been demolished that were not listed. The response was always staff at the city was underfunded and understaffed. They did not have the ability to do everything. So my problem with this report that just came out is that it is so broad brushed right now in terms of listing banal buildings that are such secondary contextual buildings. I think that it's a misuse of the process to be trying to preserve the streetscape and the scale of a neighborhood through listings. Because I think that there is a sense that if everything is valuable, then nothing is valuable. If the city feels that these areas in particular in Midtown are not worthy of being heritage conservation districts, but they are worthy of maintaining the village-like scale that they have right now, then what I would ask is that as the secondary plan evolves, that the list be perfected and the best buildings be kept. So I look, for example, like on Eglinton West, which is actually my own neighborhood, there's an inherent contradiction by saying secondary buildings should be preserved to maintain the scale, when you've also got an LRT being built underneath Eglinton, Eglinton Connects, which is, in another planning study, is already calling for 10 to 11-story buildings. So I'm fine with the idea that the best buildings get preserved, but the idea that every building, and I grant the fact that not every building is on the list, but one questions the quality of, I'd say, the bulk of these buildings. This is also combined with the fact that the city already has a backlog, as reported, of over 1,200 buildings that they haven't even addressed yet. So to use this as the opportunity for staff time to be listing a lot of these very secondary buildings, I don't think is a great use of staff time. So what I would ask is that as the process evolves, they should perfect the list. And I also want to make particular mention of one building in the area that is not on the list, that should be on the list, that was supported by staff, by the Preservation Board, by the OAA, and by the Architectural Conservancy, and that's Davisville Public School at 43 Millwood. That building should be on the list, and it's not on the list. So in conclusion, all I would say is that I think that the process should evolve. I think that the list should be perfected. I think there's too many buildings on the list right now, and I think that care should be taken in that direction.
Thank you. Questions from non-member of the committee? Councillor Matlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Switzer, you said in your deputation that you believe this was a waste of staff time and that there, in your words, that these are secondary buildings on the list that don't merit heritage preservation listing. What discussions have you had with heritage staff, if any, to make that determination? In other words, is this how you feel or you believe? Or have you asked anyone who did the work what expertise they relied on, what tests they considered to make an objective, fair, and professional determination of what they'd want to recommend?
Okay, Mr. Chair, through you, obviously through the years I've had ongoing discussions with heritage staff, particularly with this. Spent the morning with a group, including Mary McDonald, of trying to understand the process that went through. So I've actually spent the last 3 hours before lunch discussing this with Ms. McDonald.
And you're confident that you can say in a public forum that their professional, fair, objective process of reviewing and investigating these sites, looking into any potential cultural or architectural heritage value, you've just decided that that's all for naught, that there is nothing to base any of that on?
I think that the intent of what staff was looking at was primarily context. And I think that context can be maintained through urban design guidelines, like has happened in Forest Hill Village, like in secondary plans, like when we used to do areas of special identity. It does not have to be through the listing process.
And are you a heritage planner?
No, I'm not. I'm an architect. I actually
you.
worked as a planner in City Hall here in the 80s, and I've been involved with buildings and construction all my life.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Any other questions of the deputant? Thank you very much, Mr. Switzer.
Thank you.
Eric McClelland. Is Eric here? I have Gino or Luigi Y? M-U-I-A. Is Gino here? I don't see Gino. Bob Shar? Is there Bob Shar here? Sharon Moorer, South Eglinton Ratepayers and Residents Association. Sharon, please come forward.
Is that on? Okay.
We can hear you. You get 5 minutes.
Okay. Yes, my name is Sharon Maurer. I'm chair of a heritage group at SARA, which is the South Eglinton Ratepayers and Residents Association. It's a residents association that's been active for over 50 years in our area. As our name says, we're south of Eglinton, and we go down to Merton Street on the south, Young Street on the west, and over to Bayview Avenue on the east. We also like to refer to ourselves as historic Davisville Village. Our boundary lines are very similar to those of Davisville that existed 100 years ago. Sarah is pleased with the size and scope of these listings to be added to the Heritage Registry. Sarah had over a dozen members attend Midtown and Focus meetings and workshops over the past couple years. We joined a wide array of people from sister associations, schools, community centers, condos, and BIAs. Our councillor, Josh Matlow, has been very supportive of Midtown in Focus in the process. Josh was there, I think, at every meeting, at least the ones I was at. Preservation Services and Midtown in Focus staff have clearly done a lot of work assembling this heritage list. I personally sat through Midtown in Focus meetings at round tables, and I kept saying, heritage, what about the heritage? Where's the heritage? So I say thanks to everyone who listened to me. I would like to give some historical context to the three main streets that are within Sarah's boundaries. In the 1800s, there was a clergy reserve land. It was a very large swath of land that stretched across the midsection of our area from Yonge Street to Bayview. In 1911, a land development company purchased this land and laid out a gridwork of streets known as the Glebe Manor Estates. The three main streets of Yonge, Mount Pleasant Road, and Bayview were developed at the same time as the surrounding residential community. On the west, Yonge Street has buildings dating back to 1916 and served as a gateway to the Glebe Manor Estates. In the middle, Mount Pleasant Road is sort of the heart of this new community and has two movie theaters on it, which are already received heritage designation because they were built in the 1920s. On the east is Bayview Avenue, a main street that's sort of been referred to as a main street with the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. All these streets, all these main streets, provide a historical streetscape to a village life from the past, the present, and hopefully the future. We want people to walk or drive into our neighborhoods and have a glimpse of an earlier era. We see this group of heritage listings as a milestone for Midtown to take our proper place in the City of Toronto's history and represent the 1920s and prior. This Midtown in Focus report was a product of over 2 years of intensive study with the full community involvement. Sarah asked the committee to approve the report recommendations today. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions, the deputant? Not seeing any. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks.
I have Anat Pap. Is Anat Pap here? See, you've got a laptop with you. Do you need a minute to set that up? Okay.
Good morning, I guess good afternoon at this point. First, I'd like to thank you for giving the opportunity to speak here today and voice my concerns. I'm Anat Pap. I'm an owner of 2 properties that are affected by this initiative on Mount Pleasant, 619 and 588. Furthermore, my next door neighbor, 586, has asked me to express his concern here as well, as he couldn't make it. My first concern is about the timing of this hearing and the notice we received. The notice is dated August 28th. This is less than 9 business days to the residents, property owners, and neighbors about this meeting, assuming that the mail-out went out August 28th. It's my understanding that for Committee of Adjustments, you need at least 10 business days for committee to hear any case for notice for neighbors and the neighboring properties. I'm not sure why this is any different, but again, I'm not 100% familiar with the process. I also wanted to make mention that this notice was sent right at the heart of summer, the last week where everybody's really on vacation. Like many other Torontonians, we were away, returned closer to the end of the long weekend, so literally saw this notice on Tuesday and had very little opportunity to speak to prepare and speak to the neighboring properties who are all clearly affected by this initiative and understand what their stance is. Like my neighbor Tony at 586, this was too short notice for him to come in person and voice his concerns. And I believe many property owners have missed this notice as well, given the timing of year, the insufficient time we had to prepare for this meeting. Not to mention the fact that most of the property owners that are affected here don't live on these properties. They're tenanted to businesses and other residences, and they don't visit the property on a daily basis, as the properties are mostly leased out. My neighbor 590 Mount Pleasant, which is a right of me, completely was unaware of this meeting when I called him last night and asked him if he's aware of it. So my point is that we just didn't have enough notice to prepare to come and to be aware and to be involved. Furthermore, as a property owner, I've received no information about this, and I struggle really to see the merit and the spirit behind this, so I look forward to hearing that and understanding what this is all about. The other thing about the notices we received, it said Ward 26 on it, and then when I read Phase 1 agenda, clearly indicates my properties, and I'm in Ward 22, and it also speaks to Ward 16 and 25 on top of it. But my notice only said Ward 26, which caused a confusion for some property owners saying, oh, this only affects Bayview, when in fact it really affects a whole lot of other streets. From my limited understanding of this, this proposal will add most storefront properties like mine to the heritage list, which will in turn limit the ability of businesses who have been operating there for years and new businesses who would like to operate on the main street in Toronto. It will limit them anywhere from erecting signage to market their property, to changing the facade of the building to property market their business. To me, that's detrimental to any business, small or large, trying to grow the Toronto economy, and it will certainly hinder progress and development on major streets. For me, given the lack of time I've had to prepare for this meeting and given the lack of information regarding this initiative, I'm sure there's many more fallouts that I'm unaware of or don't have access to at this point. I ask that you at least give the neighbors and the property owners time to understand what this means to their property, and a proper time for people to become aware of meetings such as this, so that proper discussion can take place in the interest of all parties. Summary, like many of my fellow property owners who I have had the chance to speak to in the last couple of days, we're extremely concerned about this proposal and opposed to this proposal, as it really limits the spirit of the purpose of what these properties are existing for and have existed for many, many years, to operate a successful retail or service business along the most walk traffic streets in Toronto. Thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you. Are there any questions of the deputant? Thank you very much for coming. The last deputant I have is Mr. Jeff Kettle. You're hustling right across there. Thank you. We're here.
Thank you, Councillor Shiner and members of the committee. Pleased to be here to represent on this day the North York Community Preservation Panel, which is city-appointed committee for the North York part of the city. And we'd like to express our strong support for this initiative. It's actually been a long time coming. The Main Street areas in the Young Eglinton Growth Centre and the adjacent areas are under tremendous pressure for development, for redevelopment. Listing in this manner, it's just listing. I mean, let's sort of take a breath. It's just listing. There's no legal, nothing on title. It's simply putting a property address on a list, which has the effect only of requiring an assessment if there's a demolition permit that is submitted to the city. These areas are under tremendous pressure. This will prevent, as of right, demolition. And this has been happening, as even Mr. Switzer admitted, of commercial properties without any prior assessment of the cultural heritage values of the property. Residents across Toronto, as you recall, last January, were outraged by the as-of-right demolition of commercial properties, like the one at 244 Yonge Street, the BMO Bank of Montreal. They got a permit on a Friday, legally, a demolition permit. Saturday morning, there were emails flying around, it's being demolished. What can we do? Nothing could be done. It was legal. There was no listing in place. It was an as-of-right demolition. Thank you very much. That's not quite the case with, as you're aware, with residential properties, but with commercial, that is the case. And by the way, the comment that we should be adding to the list and including Davisville Public School, that would be great, except that this list is only dealing with commercial properties. And I understand from staff, from the report, that there will be additional properties coming back that are in the residential, perhaps institutional categories of land use. And so we'll have a chance to look at those as well. I'd like to refute the idea that somehow this has come out of the blue and people weren't informed. As Ms. Sharon Moore indicated, there's been lots of public engagement with respect to Midtown in Focus. And Heritage has been part of that, and we applaud that for the first time, perhaps, in this. These planning studies are now, for the first time, including Heritage as part of the analysis. We need this. We need to understand where our communities have come from and allow them to move carefully into the future with some consideration, not in a tornado way, but in a considered, thoughtful way. And by having preventing demolition over the nighttime, over a weekend, is about the best way we have of dealing with that concern. There has been public engagement, and there's other cities like Los Angeles do this, and we're way behind other cities in North America. I guess that's about it. I don't think this is an earth-shattering event. It's something that needs to happen. It actually balances the situation to what we have in residential areas, where there has at least got to be a replacement building approved. A heritage assessment would identify the heritage attributes which should be preserved, and those can be built into, in a creative way, in whatever is being proposed. And so we can anticipate that our streetscapes will be maintained in a manner to which we would prefer that they be continued. Hopefully the butcher, baker, and candlestick maker will continue on my favorite street, which is Bayview. Thank you.
Are there any questions of the deputant? Not seeing any. Thank you very much for coming. On my list, I don't have any other deputants, but you wanted to speak? Please come forward.
It's kind of a little pink sheet this morning, but okay.
Just tell the committee, I know you were in my office before as well, you said you
Yes.
wanted to speak. But for the record, could you please tell my colleagues here and clerks your name?
Hi, I'm actually really nervous, so as I sound like a dork, please forgive me.
Oh,
My name
don't
is-
don't be really nervous. We're definitely not that special, and we kept you waiting all day.
My name is Maria Fowler, and my husband and I own and operate the Little Dollhouse Company on Mount Pleasant. We also happen to be the building owners. We kind of jumped into this in 2001 on the other side of the street at 617, and then 2 years later, I'm a great giant shopaholic, so we had to sell 617 and move across the road to 612, which is actually one of the properties you guys are considering. It's actually 610, I guess, city designation, and goes to 18. We are proud owners of 50 feet along Mount Pleasant west side of the road. I listened carefully to the two speakers who spoke earlier regarding the preservation of Mount Pleasant and preservation of the village thing. And it's all well and good, but since the time I moved in to our building when we bought it in 2003 to now, our taxes went up from about $12,000 for our lovely 50 feet to over $60,000. We are considered, I guess, because property values keep going up and because there's towers going up all around us, or in a similar area, not in my street, but in a similar area, we keep getting assessed as if we are a giant industrial building. All we do is a few doll houses, and we have 4 apartments upstairs. And I can honestly tell you that my taxes, if I wasn't operating the building myself and actually had a business there, my 4 apartments that I rent upstairs, which are very sweet and quaint, do not cover my tax bill alone, okay? I also have a very small commercial tenant that helps us out. It's all well and good to preserve history, but geez, if we preserved history, we'd all be still living in the 1920s. We would have roads with horses and no cars. We would have, beautiful Victorian architecture and sewage on the streets. If we really wanted to preserve our entire heritage, it's really, really lovely to go to a museum and visit it, but try living in one of these things. And we think that this is kind of a hammer approach to, trying to keep our history and disregarding everything that's going on there. First and foremost, to our businesses, we're there to, serve the community. And the lady who spoke and the gentleman who spoke, who are such wonderful preservers of our community, I don't think I've seen either of them in my store, and I'm a pretty predominant store in the area. So it's not like the community actually shops on Bayview, or it actually shops on Mount Pleasant, or it actually shops on Yonge Street. Maybe somewhat, but mostly not. And what I hear is kind of a NIMBY kind of thing, saying, well, we really don't want development in our front yard. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna go and talk to all our city politicians and tell them how wonderful all these places are, and we don't wanna lose them, therefore let's make them all heritage buildings. We're just bricks. We're 2-story ugly bricks, most of the buildings that are there. And what makes them interesting is the businesses that are inside. Obviously, you cannot tell us all that you have to be, as I was told earlier today, that you have to be a dollhouse store forever, because that's what they love about me. When I cannot do business in my little 2-story building and 50 feet where my taxes are completely pushing me out of business, and then being told on the other hand, oh, by the way, we're gonna hamper your building's value by putting it on some kind of a list, and now we have to ask permission, or we have to have some kind of municipal involvement. That scares me half to death. I mean, this meeting alone, where it was called for 9:30, we killed ourselves through traffic. We left the house in unprecedented time of 7:30 this morning. You guys don't know, I've never been up at 7:30 in my life. I'm in retail, okay? So we left at 7:30 from our David's Ward house. We fought through traffic down the same Mount Pleasant through our wonderful construction season, and we made it. We made it. We rolled into the parking lot at 9:30, and I was worried you guys are gonna lock the doors. And we got here at 9:32, and there was nobody here. Or very, very few people. I said, well, geez, nobody cares. Like, where is everybody? And then in about an hour, we got filled up, and then we were told that we're having no meeting. So I'm sorry I'm running on. This is what I do. To me, it just sounds like it's a nice must-have, and we can all dream. But those of us that live and work in the city and try to actually run those buildings, it's not that simple. And the other lady wasn't wrong. The first time I heard about it was last week. I got a letter in my store dated August the 28th saying, oh, by the way, would you like to come to a meeting? We're going to discuss heritage designations. And I said, well, can't possibly be about us, but I asked one of my staff to actually look into it, and she says, well, I can't because the notes aren't out yet. So actually on Tuesday morning, when I came in at my retail time of 11 o'clock, since I pay staff to open the store for me, she left a note on my desk saying, hey, Maria, guess what? We're on the list. Maybe you should attend.
Maria, I need you to.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So I guess in
You may get
conclusion-
questions after, but I need you to wrap up. And
Yeah,
then
I
we'll
guess
open it
that's,
to
I've said everything. I'm sorry, I was kind of running on and on, but I'm done.
No, thank you very much. Never having come to a committee before and taking the time off work, it's wonderful that you actually did that. We do have questions of you, though. My colleague, Councillor Matlow, would like to ask you a question.
Sure.
Hi, thank you for your persistence at being here. And
Well, we were afraid of the drive back.
By the way, I take the same route, so I can empathize with the challenges there. So I've got 4 really quick questions, and then I want to give you my business card to respect the committee's time, and you'll see why I'm going to ask these. I'd like to ask you if you would consider that when MPAC, and a provincial agency that assesses your property value, which is really the biggest determinant on an increase in taxes, consider that they don't care about heritage listing or not. That's not what they're.
Oh, I know.
Right. So that's a challenge that I know that you and many of your neighbors deal with, and that's something that needs to be dealt with. And I know the mayor has been talking a lot about how MPAC affects small businesses in Toronto and making it a priority, which I agree with him on. Another thing I'd like you to consider is that if anyone is telling you that this heritage listing will sterilize your property or other people's properties, they don't actually know what they're talking about, and they might be misinformed. So I'd just like to ask you to consider that, and I'd be happy to talk with you a little more about that. Third thing, are you aware that my daughter loves your store? All the kids in the community do, and we appreciate you. And the last thing is, would you please take my card? I'm going to give it to you now, and I'd like to talk with you soon and talk in greater detail
Councillor
about the
Matlow.
reality of the impacts of this listing.
I do. The only thing I want to say about it being a listing, and I know Mary was very kind.
Yeah.
And she spent a long time trying to explain to me that it is just a listing. It really doesn't mean anything. But, perception is like, I don't know the exact words, but like possession is 9/10 of the law, perception is 9/10 of what's going to happen. And because I had a perception, and every single shop owner on Mount Pleasant, and I'm sure on Bayview, and I'm sure on Mount Pleasant, the minute they got these letters, and there is a heritage word in there, perception is 9/10 of the law. And the minute if I decide to put my building on sale, even if I decide to rent my other half, and there's something out there, somewhere out there, or some real estate agent who's going to say, oh, by the way, you should buy this building, not this building, because this one could be a problem because it's got the preservation thing and heritage thing all over it. I don't know. To me, it just says that my property value just dropped, okay, because the city wants to have its hand in it.
And then I'll conclude with just ask you if you would consider that I know that there are feelings and beliefs and certainly fears about what might happen, but I hope that you will meet with me or talk with me to discuss the reality as I know it about what this actually means. And it does mean something, but it means really a tripwire and a test of heritage. It doesn't mean that your property will be sterilized forevermore. But let's talk, and I'll give you my card.
Certainly. Thanks for listening to me ramble, guys.
Okay, thank you.
There you are.
I don't see any other questions. Okay, so I don't have any other speakers on the list. Well, she has a store on Councillor Massol's ward and lives in mine. Okay, so we're going to bring it now to committee. Are there questions? Maybe,
I have a
Mr.
question,
Lynn,
staff.
before we do that first, can I get our staff's attention over there? Mr. Linternale? Sorry. That's okay. There are some questions, but can we get a brief explanation through you as to what the intent is of the list here and the impact, and how it will impact, the impact of the list, and what it might do to impact people that wish to renovate their properties?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I can begin, and Ms. McDonald can supplement. My view of this exercise is that it's a screening exercise in order to lay down the city's interest in these buildings as potential heritage properties under the Heritage Act. So it allows the city to identify in advance. We know that there's a lot of change sweeping through Yonge and Eglinton. So it allows us to identify in advance for all the stakeholders, the community, the landowners, the people who are assembling land for development purposes, other landowners, and the city. It allows us to increase our awareness about what those heritage resources might be, and it puts in place a procedure for further evaluation of those properties, because when you move from a listing to a designation, you do further work to understand exactly what all those attributes might be. So in my experience, we've been challenged with getting out in front of change, and this is a method of the city managing its affairs better by identifying what those resources might be and being more proactive. And maybe Ms. McDonald wants to supplement that.
Yeah, in practical terms, listing does not allow the city to legally control anything. We can't refuse signs. We can't refuse changes to the building. The only thing that it does two things, actually. One is it ensures that if someone wishes to demolish a building that's on the register, they have to give the city 60 days notice of that demolition. Within that time, that further evaluation that Mr. Linton has talked about will be done, and City Council would make a determination about whether or not it was significant enough to be designated. So that's one thing. So if you want to demolish it, it has an implication for having to give us notice that you want to do that. The other thing that it does is if your property becomes a part of a development or a land assembly, then our official plan policy says that it has to be looked at and to be conserved as a part of any development based on its value. So right now, the values are stated in a very preliminary way. As part of a development, that would be looked at in more detail. So it remains a flexible process.
Councillor Matlow, questions?
The staff, through you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Switzer, and I know others, have characterized your work in ways that challenge the wisdom of recommending certain sites or even all sites in the list or many sites for listing. And there's been language used by some to, again, just to be dismissive of even the test that you considered. Could you just, as briefly as possible, just explain, when you investigate potential heritage listing, what do you consider and how do you evaluate it? And in this case, how did you arrive at the conclusion in general that these should be on the list of exactly 258?
Well, the first thing that we do is we look at the history of the area. And in this case, we're looking at the history of several areas in that they're early villages that eventually became a part of the City of Toronto. So each of the main streets, as one of your deputants pointed out, was really a main street for a village context. And so those buildings have a history relative to that period. We also look at architectural value. We look at its contribution to the area. And we also look at, and I think this is where the public interest in the city's evaluation might differ from Mr. Switzer. He talks about the best buildings. And I think the idea of a best building is not one that's really supported within the Heritage Act, which speaks to community value. And I think you've heard from Sarah and others that the community values these main streets. They existed to serve the residents, and the residents still love them, and they value them. And so that is a very important part of what the city looks at in terms of value. Is community value, historical value, social value, architectural value. Any of those values or any combination of those values creates heritage value.
Some have suggested that in some way this is going to get in the way of building affordable housing, or that there will never be any mid-rise on any of these sites. Will this listing automatically sterilize these sites, or is this simply ensuring that we don't have repeats like 2444 Yonge Street that was mentioned earlier? In other words, is this really more of a proactive effort to allow, to keep the reins in our hands to be able to determine whether or not it requires further heritage protection or make allowances for redevelopment?
It's the latter. It does not create a sterilized environment at all.
And lastly, no, that's fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Barlow, did you have questions? I saw you before like this. Okay. And then I have Councillor Perks.
So how does this compare with the work that we're doing on Queen Street? Like, why didn't we go and do a planning study, a heritage conservation study? Because you just used words like history of the area. So I can understand that if there's a historic context in the area that needs to be kept, like, why not go through all that instead of just going off and listing properties?
What we are doing is we're taking the opportunity of large-scale and even smaller-scale planning studies across the city and understanding their history and their existing conditions.
As an area.
As an area, and this is
So
happening
why
throughout
not
the
going through a conservation study? Like, why going into some of these properties?
We evaluated the area as a whole, and we looked for two things: properties that had heritage value or interest or potential heritage value, and we also evaluated it based on an
On what
understanding of whether or not it was significant enough to warrant a conservation district.
On what principles? Like, don't you have the planning study and the heritage study to set those principles, to set the goals, and then you list the properties based on what you've identified through those studies?
Yes,
Aren't you starting from the end of this process?
No, we've done exactly what you are suggesting we should be doing. We've done a study. We had a consultant review the area. We worked with that consultant to create a Midtown in Focus heritage planning study. It went to various community consultation meetings over the last couple of years. We developed a list from the consultant's study. We further reduced that list.
Well, how come
refined
your
it.
descriptions in here don't refer to any of those principles? Like, I'm looking at some of these properties, and you're listing them as heritage because of the setback and the position of the building and the flat roof of the building. It's
We are putting an understanding of the preliminary heritage value and attributes. And you've seen these reports before. They're all individually done, and there's no question this is a new way. This isn't the first time. We've been doing it on other planning studies as well, and we have planning studies that we've done where when Mr. Switzer talks about a backlog, in fact, that backlog isn't 1,200 individual properties. It actually contains a lot of planning studies where we've identified properties with potential heritage value that we have not been able to find the time to get on the register. We took the opportunity of this study to
So will this
get out
be a
ahead.
heritage conservation district?
No, this will be individual listings, and what you will, and we didn't believe that a conservation district was warranted. That's a much greater form of control than we think is necessary in this area.
Councillor Perks, you had a question.
Thank you very much. On page 9 of the report, it says that this kind of listing is unprecedented. So this is something, approach of listing this many properties at once. We've never done it before, right?
This number, no.
Has any municipality in the province of Ontario, to your knowledge, done a batch listing like this based just on the age of the building?
Yes, yeah.
A batch listing based only on the age of the building?
Oh, on the age of the
Yes.
building, yes.
City of Markham.
City
Pardon
of
me?
Markham.
City of Markham looks at just age, anything over 50 years,
I didn't
date
ask
of
if
construction.
people do it just on age. I've said a batch listing of several dozen, in this case, a couple hundred buildings based
Yes.
just on their age.
Yes,
City of Markham has done that.
City of Markham, Brampton, Ottawa, Hamilton.
Okay. And have there been challenges to those? Or maybe I should go to legal for that. I'll do that later. I'm looking at the text associated with each of the buildings. So for example, randomly, the one on page 58 and the one on page 61. I'm looking at it, and it looks to me like the text is absolutely identical except for the addresses. And I've looked at a few others like that. So pretty much for the descriptions, you did a search and replace of the addresses.
There was a common statement of value for those to which they are alike. This is why we actually went with this typology of Main Street, that they were constructed or were built of that methodology or that era, being a row building.
Right.
But each building was individually looked at and made for the description of heritage attributes.
Then why are the descriptions of heritage attributes for several of these verbatim identical except for the
Because
address?
the buildings themselves are identical.
Really? Because I'm looking at the photos and the buildings don't look identical. It says on page 11 that detailed research was not undertaken to determine additional values, including historical associations with individuals, communities, and architects. We didn't look at architects. It does say that you looked at archival maps and city directories to look at building dates. So to screen properties in or out, you looked at building dates and what else?
We looked at the integrity of the building, whether or not it had been altered.
So
We did.
a member of the City of Toronto staff went to each one of the 258 buildings on this list and determined whether it had been altered.
City of Toronto staff and a consultant that we hired, yes.
And those records are available?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I had a question for Mr. Lintern. Mr. Lintern, how many areas in the City of Toronto had main streets similar to this, that were sort of village-like main streets at the time when this neighborhood was a village main street? Beaches, Roncesvalles, Bloor West.
Likely through you, Mr. Chair, there are, I wouldn't say dozens, but more than a dozen. They're quite a common attribute of.
I would say dozens.
Common attribute of the morphology of the
So
city.
is the intention of the planning department to do batch listings for all neighborhoods that had main streets at this point in time?
I would say that we've been approaching it in many different ways. We have made determinations to proceed with, for example, certain heritage conservation districts.
Yes.
We have undertaken avenue studies where we've done an initial heritage scan and attached, for example, Queen Street East. We attached an appendix to those avenue studies so that we at least had an initial read of what the heritage attributes would be. That we.
No, I'm familiar with those.
Right.
And I guess some.
This is
you might be
kind of the
hearing in
next
my
generation,
questions.
I guess.
You get a question and answer,
I'm trying to get to a clearer question to help Mr. Lintern.
but if he's giving you an answer, let him at least finish
Yeah.
it.
I'm familiar with those kinds of processes. I've been part of them. We're doing one on Queen West. It's attached also to the work we're doing on Roncesvalles. I'm very familiar with those. And the work for those have either been to determine a heritage conservation district or specific listings of properties that have been more thoroughly reviewed than these. I've never seen one like this, and I think staff said we've never done one like this. And I'm wondering if this is how we're going to be approaching all of the older main streets in the City of Toronto from now on, because I'll tell you, everyone who lives in Ward 14 and gets their hands on this will say, why haven't you listed every building on Roncesvalles, Queen, Dundas, and Bloor? And I'm wondering if that's the approach that the planning department is going to be taking going forward.
Well, I would say generally that we've got to experiment with different approaches going forward because of the appetite for this issue in the city. When we don't do the proactive work, find some way to effectively and efficiently do the proactive work, we get ourselves into more trouble by missing important heritage resources. So we've got to find a way to more effectively approach it. This is one new way of doing it. It's obviously going to be subject to staffing and budget.
The other thing, councillors, I refer you to also in your agenda item number 6, where we discuss some thoughts about the Heritage Register and the Citywide Heritage Survey. Many have asked us to simply throw addresses on the register of a certain age. We actually don't think that's responsible. We think we need to undertake evaluation, and we have made a commitment to organizations like BUILD to evaluate them under provincial criteria, which we have done. We did not do the whole meal deal that you're used to seeing on all of them. That's true. In order for the city to have a robust heritage register and conduct a survey, that level of detail and analysis, the kind that is worthy of a designation report, is not possible. And so in this case, we're trying to find that lighter version that will allow properties to go on the register. I would ask you, though, to look at the maps that actually go with the buildings themselves. You'll see tremendous swaths of streets, with the exception of Mount Pleasant, which has a greater concentration, where there will be opportunity for where there are no listings. If you look there, it's like teeth, broken teeth in a much larger swath. It's not every building. I wish I had a percentage for you. I'm going to get that for council. But I think that this belief that we're taking every single Main Street building it needs to be challenged, because it's simply not true. If you look at the maps, we stand by our evaluations. Many of the buildings have common elements to them, so we describe them in a common way because we believe that's an easier way to understand them. We are doing similar evaluations on Roncesvalles, on Danforth, on all the major planning studies we're working on. And this is a way that the city will move forward with a heritage survey program, which council has asked us to do. But we also said in our survey report, which we can talk about more specifically, we are trying something new. We are piloting. If there are concerns, we will listen to them. If people would prefer that we not have a citywide survey, council will tell us. Right now, we're trying to find the best way.
Okay, so I have some questions, and maybe it'll help us go down that road. Let's go back as to why you did what's being called a batch. Is it just a batch that you picked, or is it in part of the fact that you're doing the Midtown in focus review?
It's
Doing shorter ones and longer ones, so I can ask you.
Yeah, very quickly, we're doing a Midtown in Focus secondary plan. This is a critical input into understanding what planning recommendations we ultimately want to make. There's a lot of change happening in Yonge and Eglinton very quickly, and we need to get a handle on the heritage input very quickly.
When you had the public meetings on Midtown in Focus, did you identify with maps areas that you were going to look to see what properties might be there for heritage purposes?
Yes, we did that. We did not release individual address after the random demolition of the 2440 Yonge Street. We were advised that if we gave out individual addresses at that time, we would not be able to hold a demolition permit. So we gave areas, and we looked at all those specific areas, but addresses are just the first time being published.
So now, because Midtown in Focus is encouraging intensification along all these major corridors, some with mid-rise, some with high-rise, you've gone back and looked at the buildings that you feel are worthy of listing. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, what does listing mean compared to designating?
Listing means that if someone wants to demolish a property, they must give the city 60 days notice of their intention to demolish.
Now, if it's a residence, they can't just draw a permit. But if it's a commercial property, there's a difference. What is that?
The difference is that residential properties have a residential demolition control bylaw, which requires that a replacement building permit be issued before a demolition permit is issued, to ensure that
In
residential
a
houses
commercial
are...
property, they can simply apply for a permit to demolish?
They can get a demolition permit within 20
So
days.
this, am I correct that by listing them, it provides an opportunity for the city to look further at the property, whether they wish to go further with designation or not, when an application comes in?
Yes.
And how long do you have to respond?
Well, we have 60 days to respond through
And that's on a
council.
complete demolition, am I correct? Not a
Yes.
renovation?
Yes,
I can take out the front doors, change, renovate my building, do anything I want.
yes.
Is there a value in this of people that are purchasing properties, knowing that there is interest in saving the heritage aspect of that area by having a listing up?
I think there's always value in people having all the information before them.
Now, we discussed when we were talking this morning, the fact that many of the properties that are now included in Midtown in Focus are facing substantial increases in their assessment, and therefore seeing substantial increases in their property taxes, not due to the city raising the tax rate, but due to the value of the property going up. In one of our colleagues' area recently, I believe that your staff sat down with the finance staff and MPAC to look at that, and because the properties had heritage value and were not being rebuilt, they were actually able to work with MPAC to see if they could reduce the assessments?
That has happened in some instances, yes.
So we might be able to look at that here and actually, by showing a listing of a property help some of these property owners with the tremendous increase that they have in their property taxes?
In combination with other understandings of as-of-right permissions and land uses, heritage conservation is not incompatible with development.
So what's the, I won't ask you, I'm going to ask Mr. Lintern. What's the negative aspect that residents have in us doing what's being called to some aspect a batch listing, but in this particular case with Midtown in focus, and what's the benefit of it?
From a planning point of view, we need to bring recommendations to City Council that are comprehensive. Bringing recommendations to City Council about what the best plan for Yonge and Eglinton will be without a heritage layer in that recommendation, to me, would be incomplete. So some way, shape, or form, and this is what we're trying to do across the city in various planning studies, is add in that heritage layer in the most effective way we can. So that's the benefit to the residents indirectly, but certainly to the city as the organization that sets the public policy.
So if I ask you, when you come back with your final report on Midtown in focus, to then come back with possibly a revision to the listings after you get to meet with people and look further at these, you could also do that when they come back?
Well, the listing is the listing, but we certainly will take into account in our recommendations the fact that there is a listing of heritage properties at Yonge and Eglinton.
Right, but if persons come to you between now and the final report and sit and discuss with you the aspects that you have, it's possible for you to recommend a removal of that property from the listing?
It is not something that we typically do to recommend the removal of a listing. I don't know if Ms. McDonald can comment on it, but I'm not aware of a delisting process that the city has. But certainly, if we become aware that a property through a redevelopment process is not worthy of designation, for example, then the process can proceed without any further review of a heritage matter. So it's a screening that takes place that either sends you in one direction or another. It may send you to a conclusion that there is no further heritage interest.
My time is up. Is anyone looking for a second round, or can we go to speakers? Unfortunately, you can't. Questions are for members of council to ask of the city staff. Okay, so we're finished with questions. We have speakers, and I see Councillor Matlow would like to speak.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you also for attending one of our Midtown and Focus meetings to see firsthand the work that we've been doing. This work began, I just want to give you some context, over the past 6 years. I actually believe this work should have been done 20, 30 years ago. The reason that we're doing this work is because Yonge and Eglinton, as you know, is a growth center and, not very unlike North York or downtown, where we have seen unprecedented growth. In fact, the density has gone further than all of the initial growth targets that the province prescribed. And there is a challenge when it comes to both soft infrastructure, social services, hard infrastructure, and protecting the character of the community. So we put forward in motion an initiative that initially started reviewing public space so that we could come up with creative ways to both enhance and protect and create new public realm, mid-block connections, parks, plazas, etc. The next phase has been a secondary plan review. Secondary plan review is looking at everything one can imagine to support a livable community. Looking at everything from recreation space, affordable childcare, community services, looking at transit, looking at the pipes and the wires. How many units do you build in one place before the toilets don't flush or the electricity doesn't go on? So it's looking at it holistically. It's looking at social services and infrastructure. Very similar to TOcore. One critical component is heritage valuation. And what our heritage staff has done, as part of a holistic study to ensuring that this is not just a bunch of condos everywhere, but really is a livable community, is to do an objective assessment of heritage value, both cultural and architectural. They did this. They did this independently, and they came back with their recommendations of a batch of 258 properties. What this will do is ensure that, unlike the 2444 experience, where staff and council were under fire, understandably, from the community there, that Nobody did anything proactive to stop that old building from being knocked down. And frankly, they weren't able to, because you know legally that once there's an approval by either the province or the OMB or City Council for development, that they can go and demolish pretty much when they want to, and we, as a city, cannot deny them a demolition permit. What this does is that it sets a tripwire, or as Mr. Linton said, a screening, to ensure that there's some reasonable opportunity for an assessment, whether or not it merits full designation, or perhaps it should be part of a redevelopment where appropriate, or perhaps somewhere in between where perhaps some part of the character or some definition of the built form can be a component of the new building. One way or another, though, we don't want to just see block after block being busted for glass condos. And that's what we're trying to get ahead of. And you know as well as I do, Yonge and Eglinton is under remarkable pressure, unlike most areas of the province, because it was a prescribed growth node. So we're trying to get ahead of that. If you shelve this, you'll be playing with fire. You will be jeopardizing 6 years of work, a very thoughtful process, a deeply consultative process where we've involved, for first time in history, North York and Toronto East York staff have been working at the same table as a team, led by our planning department under Paul Farish. We have had ratepayers associations, BIAs, all sorts of institutions like the Ann Johnson Health Station, tenant boards, et cetera, all condo boards, everybody coming together to work on this holistically, but based on facts, not out of fears or beliefs or hopes or aspirations, but to use facts to make arguments about what is good planning, not anti-growth or for growth, but what actually makes sense in context of the community and building a livable community. I understand the politics here too. There are some of you who may wonder, well, if we do this in Midtown, then what do I say to my residents in Davenport or Parkdale or elsewhere? What do you say? What do you say? I'd submit to you this. A, this was part of a comprehensive study about an urban growth center. It was unique, it was specific. But also, this is hopefully where we're going to be going from here. As Councillor Perks was asking, is this going to be more and more common? Well, I'm going to speak to the survey issue earlier because both I and Councillor Shiner and others have moved motions in the past asking for a proactive survey in the city. And what I hope to see in the future is more and more avenues, more and more areas being surveyed proactively so that we could put these screens in place. This shouldn't come at the expense of anyone else, but this has to come. Because if we don't do it at Yonge and Eglinton, the pressure here is unique and it's unlike most areas of the city. I ask you on behalf of our community and on behalf of our professional staff to please support these recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Committee members that wish to speak, Councillor Perks.
So I'm gonna vote to have this go on to council, but I'm not yet satisfied. And I'm gonna need to spend some time digging into this between now and council. I listened carefully to what Councillor Matlow said, and what I heard is there is a lot of development pressure at Yonge and Eglinton, so we should use this tool to try to alleviate that pressure. I heard it quite clearly. It's unique, there's huge pressure, we don't want to lose every block, we got to get ahead of the growth. And I hear these things sometimes from members of the public as well. I've heard them at meetings about the very, very thorough piece of work we're doing to create a heritage conservation district at Queen Street. There are members of the community who are increasing of the butcher and the baker and so on. And those are important things to do. We have to keep that Main Street feel. Absolutely we do. Listing, and I'm very familiar with this section of Mount Pleasant. Actually, my childhood home was between Yonge and Mount Pleasant, just north of Eglinton. So I know these areas well. And there are some lovely old buildings. But like listing every single one of them along a stretch of Mount Pleasant, I have to ask myself if we're going to be able to defend that as a legitimate desire to protect a heritage value, or whether we're actually just trying to prevent development and trying to maintain mixed-use retail. Because there are other planning tools available to maintain mixed-use retail. We've done stuff in terms of putting into the mid-rise guidelines floor plate sizes. I had a concentration on bars and restaurant bylaw passed on Queen Street that's going to be coming up for review this year. Mr. Lintern's quite familiar with the work that's going to have to be done on that. There are tools available. I am concerned that if we pick this tool because it happens to give us some mechanisms for constraining demolition permits, or it puts a new burden on someone making a development application in that they have to go out and get a heritage consultant to do a piece of work as part of their application, that we will lose the integrity of actually listing and designating properties. When really important heritage properties that were not listed or designated on Roncesvalles came up recently, the Heritage Department did fantastic work because they knew the value of those buildings, and we were able, because our heritage listing and designation process is highly respected and has a lot of integrity, we were able to go and deal with it. I worry that if we try to use this tool to achieve a different policy end, then the integrity of that process is weakened, and our ability to use it when it's meaningful is also weakened. Those are the questions that I'm going to have answered for me before I go to council. And the other thing is, I am very concerned that if there are 250 here and there are a couple dozen more neighborhoods like this, are we in the process of saying, no, we're going to impose a new process on several thousand properties, and we're going to do that in order to save staff resources? Well, no. If you're putting this extra bunch of work on several thousand properties, you are not saving staff resources. You are adding to the demand on staff resources. So there's a lot that, frankly, isn't explained in the staff report here. It's thick, but it's thick because it has many, many times the same text repeated with different addresses and some photographs. But it's not thick in terms of explaining what this means in terms of us achieving our official plan goals of settling new population in the city, which is a good thing to do, and our real review of the kind of city we want to have 20 and 50 years from now. This is a change in how we approach that without an explanation of how we're meeting our other planning goals.
I didn't see any other speakers. I do have a couple of motions I'll put up, and then I'll speak to it. And before I do that, Councillor Matlow wanted to rise on a point of privilege. I said, not a committee member, but he wanted to be clear that he was saying he wasn't anti-development, and I think his comments were, although they came out one way, misconstrued as to what he was trying to do as far as controlling development. We sometimes use words that maybe we shouldn't, but I'm not going to go into it. So if I can get my motions up there, we still be up, put them up first. That one first. So the first motion is to deal with the fact that there's 60 days, but many people have said, when we even discussed it, how can I consult with people? How can I talk? And sometimes it's difficult. So this is meant to make sure that there's a way that they can easily talk with people about the listing. The second part is to try and deal with the issue of the property taxes that seem to be increasing in areas of development, see if there's a way to get impact to help with it. And the third motion, if you wish to support it or not, is to see if there's any properties you may wish to take off the register when the final report comes up, if people have met with staff or there's a reason for it to take off the listings. And then I'll speak to it, and I think, Councillor Perks, you're right, everyone's right. It's a change in how we do things. But it's a change that's necessitated, I believe, on the fact that we came out with a big review of the large area that's in the map that you have of Midtown, and we're talking about all those areas for intensification. And those areas then face tremendous pressures, but we haven't said which are the properties that might be worth saving from a heritage aspect. So staff came back, took a look through it at the request of council, and said, all these properties might have a potential for these reasons, so we want to list them, not designate them. And it was interesting in discussion with residents in my office who said, why don't you just give me an answer whether you're going to designate it? Mr. Switzer really said, you don't want that answer because you may get it designated. It's much more flexible to deal with the property, with the city when you're redeveloping if it's listed, because it's more comprehensive. And it really is to try and look at the Midtown villages, the fact that these areas have corridors that might be worth protecting as you go forward, and how can you deal with that or aspects of that as you go forward with development. It's not listing, it's not designating the property. It's coming out and saying there's an interest in it, which is really what we've done with every residential property, because you can't tear any of them down without having a building permit. But on a commercial property, someone can apply for a permit, and in 30 days, the building department has to, by legislation, give them a permit, unless we have done something. And by having a listing on it, at least there's a chance to do a review and see if you do wish to designate it, and then council will make that decision, not staff at the end. So I kind of look at it as a fairer process as well, because when people assess areas for redevelopment, they look at all these and there's a difference. There's a discrepancy which sometimes between the developer who says, let me take it all down, but I'll give you a podium and I'll give you some retail at grade, and it'll be great. You'll love it. It'll be wonderful. And it doesn't come out looking that way because we can't really deal with exactly what the building looked like or the outside, or we can get appealed to the board, internal municipal board, and then we have little control because instead of a planner dealing with it, no disrespect, Mr. Haley, it's a lawyer dealing with it, trying to make the best deal they can make based on the height and density and not necessarily the best built form because we're losing control of it. So this puts out a list of properties that there's an interest in within an area that we've already said is subject to high density development. Some is high rise, some is mid rise, different areas. And the list is out there to do that. It's not a heritage conservation district. That would be a huge study and a lot of staff resources again. And many of these areas don't fit it. Staff didn't recommend it. And it's not the same as I know my colleagues and we all face it. Well, what about this street and that street or Willowdale Avenue or Queen Street or different areas? This is part of, it's part of the Midtown in Focus review and something that we should have made very public that we were going to do from the beginning. And we should do it on every major review to identify those heritage properties that may be of interest to protect the feel and the look of that community, which is what makes them so successful. But at the same time, it's not meant to take away the ability for someone to sell their property or redevelop their property or use their property. So it's that mix between it, and it is different, but in judging the pros and the cons of it, I think it's better to adopt it and go forward with it, with, of course, a couple of minor changes we can have to try and deal with it than not. And I think it's going to be a substantial debate at council, and staff are going to have to do some work in the meantime. Mr. Lintern, I think you and your staff, if this committee approves it, are going to have to take some time to go around to the councillors and explain what this is, what your intention is, and answer the questions, because even today from my colleagues here who are well informed on it, it's still a real question as to how it goes forward and how it works. I'm supporting it. I'm putting the motions on. I split them because two of them I think are simple motions. You can all approve the third motion, whether you want to look at taking something off the listings or not. That's your own decision on it, but Mr. Switzer and had spoken about possibly having a review at the end, and that's some way to accommodate that if there is some change. And I think it's worth going forward with. It's good action. It's trying to save that look of the city that's made us different. We don't have a lot that we're saving. And in areas we've lost them, in the example that was used, and then I'll stop. I apologize for not timing myself. If you look at Yonge and Bloor, Stollery's came down, no control. The block came down. We couldn't stop it. A block to the north at Yorkville is saving all the facades, and they're building high-rise behind it. Same area, same issue. If the properties at Yonge and Bloor, where Stollery's were listed, then staff would have had an opportunity to see whether they wanted to incorporate the facade or part of that building into the new building. And that would have been then the decision of their recommendation as council would have decided. The staff don't decide. Council would have decided if they wished to do that. Because at the end of the day, departments write reports, committees make recommendations, and council makes the decision. In that case, we didn't have an opportunity to even consider it. Any other speakers? If not, then we'll call the vote on the items. The item that's up on the screen that I moved, all those in favor? Opposed? That carries. My second motion, all those in favor? Opposed? That carries. The item is amended. All those in favor? Opposed? That carries. Thank you. So we've dealt with one item at 3 o'clock. Oh, okay. All right. Councillor Fletcher is here, and you wanted to deal, which I don't think it's a long item. It is the, which one were you, I held it for you. 721 Easter, the GM proposal, which is item number 3. Did you wish to just speak to it, Councillor?
I have a motion. I did have one question for staff.
Okay, so questions of staff. We're going to deal, with committee's permission, can I deal with item 22.3? All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. Councillor Fletcher had a question.
Thank you so much. And thank you for accommodating me, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that very much. I just wish to know from staff, and Councillor
I need to get
in the
a
way.
little clearing up over there so we can get the questions asked.
It just has to do with this application and the percentage of it that is research and development. What are the percentages as far as there's a car dealership? What's that percentage? There is an office associated with that. There's R&D. There's electric cars. I'd just like to be a little clearer, if that's possible.
As, I don't know if I have the percentages off the top of my head, but on page 4 of the report, it identifies the development statistics, which include over 4,000 square meters of office. Dealerships, the equivalent, about roughly the equivalent, dealerships would be about just over 4,000 square meters. So those are the two main uses that are being proposed. There are service areas as well, which deal with the repair of automobiles, which tend to be somewhat land consumptive, but in this case, they're about 2,000 square meters. There is a small R&D workshop that's proposed, and then there are parking areas as well, because it is going to involve the sale of automobiles. That is the initial site. There is a second site, 2 more sites that are to be developed in phases that include up to 44,000 square meters of office uses, supported by some retail. So in the initial instance, it's a much smaller focused project around the car dealerships with some office, and in the fullness of time, a much larger office-focused development.
And the number of acres in the, we'll call it the Phase 1, with 10,000 square meters, not square feet.
The total size of the site, Councillor? Sorry?
The total size of the site, the original application was covering the entire site, and now this application for the actual.
The site
The end
area is
part.
approximately 24,000 square meters.
Of course, you know I like acres.
The density overall, if you look at the total amount of development proposed, is about 3.5 times. So again, the total amount of non-residential GFA, well, this is a non-residential development, is about 82,000 square meters.
All right, and we'll have time to go into this a little bit. Our goal would be to intensify employment uses on this site.
Yes, that's the official plan designation for the site, and we've been working over a long period of time with the adjacent smart centers application, for example, that came through council a couple of years ago, to include, when someone's proposing some retail development, to also include office and other uses. On that development, we were able to secure some film-related uses.
Quite a bit, actually.
Quite a bit.
92,000 square feet. So just, I'll leave that and just go to the transportation pieces here. This is, I think it's 10 acres or 11 acres. And then there's the Smart Center, Studio Center site, 22 acres. And then there is the Unilever site, which is, the master plan is over 68 acres. So adding that up, that's just under kind of 100 acres here for development within this employment area. And as far as all of the planning and transportation work that's been done, would you agree with me that it's time now, when we have a development on one end with GM and a proposed development with Unilever on the other, to really look at that corridor, Eastern Avenue itself? Number one, what's the relationship to all the residential, small, single-family residential to the north? And what will that corridor look like with this amount of office and employment uses?
Yes, through the chair, the area has been subject to the Southeastern Transportation Servicing Master Plan that has looked comprehensively at projections for development, employment related development in this area and the associated area in the Portlands. So we have recommendations coming forward in that context. We also have previously had recommendations that have been adopted by council to the Director of Transportation Services to advance some comprehensive thinking, as you point out, to advance some comprehensive thinking and ultimately traffic mitigation measures for the area as a whole, because of the intimacy that this area has with its adjoining residential community and the need to, manage travel demand and prevent undue effects on the neighboring communities, the neighboring schools, the parks, and the other facilities in the area.
But the servicing and master plan did not cover the adjoining residential or the impact between Eastern and Queen. Would you agree?
Yes, I would say that
Councillor Fletcher, I need you to wrap up.
Sorry.
And you had said just a couple of short questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's
Am I
5.5
over? I'm over.
minutes.
My apology. I was going to ask about green space.
But you know a lot of this, don't
We'll go
you?
into this more. That's fine.
We're okay with your recommendations. Are there any other members of committee that have questions? Councillor Fletcher, you wanted us to move some recommendations on your
Yes, I do. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of discussion. I did mention that we have 68 acres at one end and 11 acres at the other. That's 77 acres, which there will be active development, and a 22-acre approval for film studio and other office and hotel use in between. And this is the last freestanding employment area in the city. We are trying to maintain it, introduce office. The community is very supportive of that. But there is always this push and pull with traffic and what that's going to look like at this site. Traditionally, this site itself has been a film studio site where people come at 7 in the morning and they leave at 10 at night. So there's been very little impact in the neighborhood. This will be a come and go all day site. And even with the studio center site that hasn't been built out, there were some very clear asks about traffic mitigation, thinking ahead, as you pointed out, Mr. Lintern, getting ahead of the impact. And so these motions here relate to that. And I think if we can add this into our active oversight of 721 Eastern Avenue, then this will allow people to feel like we're thinking ahead, and the impacts this would also introduce at that particular intersection, which is a very, very tough intersection.
So
So I'd appreciate if you could support this.
bring it into committee. I'm happy to move the motion that the councillor has asked for. Are there any other speakers or questions? Not seeing any. All in favor of the amendment? Any opposed? That's carried. The item is amended. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Maybe I'll just try and clean up a couple. There was an item here that my colleague, Councillor Matlow, had asked for, PG 22.2, World Health Organization's essential features of global age-friendly city. Ms. Mavakis, are we already dealing with that?
Yes, as part of in the work program report, you'll note that we have an item about the built form policies, and we will be dealing with it through that context. In addition, we're dealing with it through studies such as TOcore, Midtown in Focus. So our secondary plan reviews will also be facilitating and advancing age-friendly.
So the committee can just adopt the staff recommendation to receive the report? Item PG 22.2. I'm going to move staff recommendations to receive the report. Councillor Fillion, my colleagues, 22.2, just receive the report as per staff recommendations. I'll move that. All those in favor? Opposed? Seeing none. Did I see any in favor? I gotta have a hand or two. Okay. Opposed? That's carried. And there is an item here that Councillor Mahevic sent in that I've been asked if I could just, by staff, defer to the next meeting. So it's on the agenda, but I'll move to defer that. That was the added item. Oh, the first down? We're just going to, you can add the words in. Excuse me for a minute. Sorry. And we're just adding in the words to include the Director of Environment and Energy, and then we're going to defer this item to the next meeting. No, I'm going to defer it. Yeah, staff wanted to talk to the councillor in regards to it before we adopt it, so I'm going to do it because of the amount of work that's around. So motion to defer the additional item that I've put on for Councillor Mahevic to the next meeting. All those in favor? Sorry, councillors. Councillor Mahevic's item, just moving to defer it to the next meeting. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. We had item 22.1 then, TOcore. We should go to that. People have been waiting for that. We have some speakers and we have a presentation. So can I get the committee's attention because we're going to have a presentation from staff? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're just putting it up on the screen now. We're going to present to you today the draft downtown plan. We've been calling this TOcore for a few years, so you may have heard of it already. We're going to provide a quick amount of background for you. Some of you may not be as familiar as others. A high-level overview of the draft plan that we've tabled with you in the report, and then we're certainly happy to take any questions after you've heard the speakers with me today are Andrew Farncombe and Anne-Marie Nasser from the City Planning Division, who are key players in advancing, among others, this project. The timeline that we've been on it's a multi-year timeline. We've been at this for a few years, starting with a proposals report in 2014, a background report, I'm sorry, and a proposals report that went to City Council at the end of last year, which was considered, and then using that all the way through with a consultation program arriving where we are today with the draft plan, hoping to come back to you in 2018 with a final report and statutory meeting for a new plan. The downtown, we like to say, is small but mighty. This is our postcard for why the downtown is so important. It's important for everybody in the city, certainly important for people who live and work there, but we found through our work that it has a great deal of importance for the entire city and for the region. Everyone has a stake in its success. It's incredibly diverse. You can see with some of those highlighted statistics there the important role that it plays in supporting the economy of the city and the attraction that it is for residential and non-residential development, and the diversity of its makeup a place for major institutions, retail, certainly residential and office development. Everybody thinks of it as the financial district, but it's so much more than that. It's a place of culture and where our hospital clusters are. So it's really got everything going on in one small area that represents only 3% of the city's land base. Oops. Fix that. Employment growth, it's interesting, we often start with residential growth, but when you think about the employment growth that's been going on in the downtown in the last 5 years, adding close to 14,000 jobs a year, it's really become a jobs machine for the entire city. It's sustaining that pattern, and by 2041, some of our projections are showing the potential to increase upwards 850 to over 900,000 jobs in the core. For residential development, which is something that people see through the various condo towers that have been developed in the city, we're on pace over the last 5 years, adding about 7,500 people a year. And this is part of, if you know your history of the city, this is part of a long story of deciding back in the 70s that downtown should be a place where people live, and a very deliberate public policy decision to make it a good place for people to live, find ways of encouraging residential development. And we were incredibly successful with that. It more than doubled by 2011 over that period, and now we're at an even faster pace of residential development occurring. And you can see that in the growth patterns. These patterns tend to mimic the designations that are in the city's official plan, where you can see from the period of 2011 through 2026 and up to 2041, the red area is getting a little redder as you toggle back and forth between the two areas, and the upside down T that the pattern of growth follows. As I indicated earlier, the potential is significant, the potential to grow the residential population to approximately 450,000 people. The plan itself that we're putting forward is a plan at an intermediate scale. Many of you may be familiar with the center's secondary plans in Etobicoke, North York, and Scarborough, and Yonge and Eglinton. This is geographically a bit larger than those, and it's a plan at a scale that covers a very diverse area of context and land uses. And it's somewhat distinct and unlike those other plans that are a little tighter to their pattern of growth that's occurring in those sub-areas. So we have to take into account, as we lay out this intermediate scale plan, the diversity of land use and scale that occurs in the downtown. We haven't been planning without planning frameworks, though. I mean, there's been a lot of guidance provided in the official plan, the policies that are in the plan about the downtown. The central waterfront has guided us, the land use plans. There are also, as the city has intensified, 10 secondary plans, site and area specific policies that get put in place, urban design guidelines, and heritage conservation districts. All of these things have added up to a certain amount of guidance, but still with all of this and the pace of growth that's occurring, we've identified the need to approach this more comprehensively and to address some of the policy gaps and set us up really for the next 20 years, 25 years looking forward to 2041. The vision that we've got for this, I think we all want to wake up in 2041 and be in a city that's livable, or a downtown that's livable, connected, resilient, really the heart of a successful and prosperous city and region. That's our vision. Our goals are set out there for you on the screen, but we've really used these goals to shape the policy directions that we've put in the draft plan. Big policy moves, and I won't read them all, but you'll hear in a minute how we've nested our policy directions in these baskets. The first one being a move to calibrate our mixed-use area designations more finely. This is a move to be more prescriptive. We've found over the years that we certainly have policy statements in our official plan that recognize that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, even in the downtown. So we've brought forward recommendations in the draft to recalibrate the scale in mixed-use areas 1 through 4, which really represent, in a simple way, areas of more intense growth and less intense growth. The mixed-use area 4 being the Kensingtons and the Cork towns of the downtown, which people associate with a much smaller scale of development. All of this is to better shape and direct growth, which adds up to areas, what we call areas of focus for growth, so that we more clearly recognize that not all areas of the downtown will grow and look and feel the same. We've got policies that we've included in the plan to be more deliberate about balancing non-residential and residential growth. So this is the focus on job growth in our institutions, expansion of the financial districts, new health sciences district, and an emphasis on supporting creative industries and culture development. The complete community lens that you often hear about as we undertake planning across the city, we've thought and worked long and hard on how to make this a lot more deliberate in linking growth and infrastructure. And if the big headline of the last 20 years was growing the population downtown, we feel this has to be the big headline when we look back and we appreciate how well or not we've been able to associate growth with the provision of infrastructure. So we're putting a lot of focus in this plan on developing 5 infrastructure strategies that will support growth and using what we're calling a complete community assessment, which is really a tool to each and every time be much more deliberate and rigorous about how we're assessing the physical and social impacts of these various developments. And when we need to step back, perhaps, and check in with our partners who deliver programs in the city about the growth, about the infrastructure that's needed to support that. Building for livability, we want to build for livability. How we do that is protecting for shadow on parks, expanding the public realm, working on developing policies that are more specific about transition, better approaches on designing and locating amenity spaces, and separation distances for tall buildings, which we've already had adopted by City Council. Policies that prioritize on-site parkland dedication. We've heard a lot about the dearth of parkland downtown, so being more deliberate about getting on-site, and actual incentives for for developers to work together to consolidate their parkland contributions. The plan, or the area of the downtown, has had a lot of attention for the achievement of parks and open space. It's never enough, and there are gaps. So we are developing a parks and public realm plan to, not unlike, for example, in Etobicoke, where there's a public realm plan for the Etobicoke Centre. So we are developing a parks and public realm to support and direct infrastructure investment in the public realm. Active transportation, certainly prioritizing that. This is not a plan about the subways. That's another file. This is a plan about what works downtown to prioritize active transportation. It includes supporting walking, cycling, surface transit, emphasizing how curbside management works better. It's a plan that thinks about the inclusiveness of the diversity of housing, which is an important vehicle to maintain the diversity of the population downtown, being more deliberate about achieving affordable housing. We already have policies that require the replacement of dwelling units. This plan includes policies around the replacement of dwelling rooms because we have a serious threat around the dehousing of those population groups in the downtown with the intensity of development that's occurring. Community services and facilities, policies to support, and certainly the strategies that I noted to make sure that that's being provided in a timely manner in alignment with growth. Resiliency in water, the city is doing a lot citywide, but we have some very downtown specific opportunities due to the density and the proximity of development downtown. There are opportunities to realize, for example, expansion of thermal networks, dealing with climate change through very specific efforts that we've been delving into around backup power for tall buildings. We've got a lot of people living in very tall buildings, and we've got to think vertically, as you've seen through our vertical communities initiative, We've got to think more vertically as we undertake planning. Policies to foster culture, for example, replacing culture space where it exists. The infrastructure strategies that we're proposing are highlighted on this screen. We've focused on the five big ones really, which are important to support the growth. The expectation is that these strategies are going to address the gaps that we have. We have some gaps. What kind of infrastructure might be needed over the planning horizon to 2041, and we're getting into order of magnitude costing because we have to inform both the city's very short-term capital budget process, its 10-year capital budget process, things that are above the line, things that are below the line, and asking divisions to think farther out than they are right now around the types of resources that will be needed to support the growth. It's been a very collaborative project, both inside the City Planning Division, with a great team. We've had great collaboration with all of the divisions and agencies that are highlighted on this screen in all the clusters. And the team kind of extends, if you'll see in the next slide, to the consultation and engagement that we've undertaken in this exercise, where we've involved Torontonians from across the city, certainly with a focus on people who live and work downtown, but we've been successful in reaching out beyond the downtown to everyone, because as indicated at the beginning, the downtown is a place that everyone experiences and benefits from in the long term. The next steps that we are recommending in the report are to undertake further consultation on the draft plan. So this is really the beginning of that feedback loop with yourselves, going out and then coming back to you in the spring of 2018 with a statutory meeting. We are, of course, working on finishing off any items in the report that are still works in progress, including the infrastructure strategies that are going to be developed and posted for public consultation later in the fall. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions, or if you would like to hear any deputations first and then take your questions, I'm in your hands.
Why don't we go to deputations? That way, if any questions come up while we're hearing from them, we'll be able to pose them with you. So, TOcore, I have Diane Dyson. You're here, Diane? And then I have just Linda Chu. Is Linda here?
Linda's had to leave, so she left me her presentation.
Oh, so you're two people.
It turns out.
Okay. Is there anybody else that registered to compute on this? Okay. So we're here to hear from you.
I'll read Linda's first because she said it's brief, and it's on behalf of the ABC Residents Association. As a board member of the ABC Residents Association area bounded by Yonge Street, Avenue Road, Bloor Street, and the railway tracks, I'm presenting today. This morning I was joined by several other of our board to represent our members. But first of all, on behalf of the people who attended this morning and cannot this afternoon, we'd like to express our disappointment at how this morning was handled. By scheduling an Etobicoke opening at the same time as the committee, it created a difficult conflict for two of its members, and as a result put quorum at risk. We are concerned that lack of quorum at this meeting may reflect a lack of interest in the TOcore planning process, and it was indeed an unfortunate outcome for the people who took time off work to be involved in this democratic process. In fact, Linda's not here because she also, thinking that she would be one of the first presenting today at 1:30, had to leave now for another meeting. Although none of the members of this Planning and Growth Committee represent the members of the downtown wards 20, 27, and 28, we expect that they understand the importance of the development in these wards to the revenue of the city as a whole, and they take the TOcore initiative as seriously as the residents and councillors of these wards do. ABCRA is here today to express their support of this important and overdue initiative. It is past time that the development of Toronto's economic engine, its downtown, with its unprecedented growth curve, is planned with the necessary infrastructure and public space to create what in time may live up to the idea of a world-class city. Our members have participated in phases 1 and 2 of this planning process. There has been much time and effort put in by both the planning staff and residents, and we support the policy directions approved by City Council. We thank you for the work to date. We are here today to witness the approval of the recommendations before you and to ensure that the momentum to implementation is not slowed with the resignation of the chief city planner and that the projected timelines will be met. We will be active in the consultations and expect to be back at this committee on schedule in the spring of 2018 to support the approval of the recommendations report and an official plan amendment on the downtown plan. Hopefully that meeting will have quorum and a celebration of, at last, a development planning policy for the downtown. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank Jennifer Keesmaat for her contribution to the planning of Toronto and wish her well. Signed, Linda Chu for the ABC Residents Association.
Okay, thank you very much. Were there any questions of the deputant on?
I probably won't be able to answer them because that was hers.
Oh, that was okay. So we'll give you a new time that you can begin and
Thank you.
start over.
Okay. Well, I too have come today to laud you for the work that is before you, pointing actually to some of the small print in the report. That is section 11.6, housing stability, which ensures the preservation of dwelling rooms. As one of the largest nonprofit housing providers in the city, Wood Green Community Services is committed to a full range of housing options so that everyone has the opportunity to thrive. We recognize that dwelling rooms, as described by city planners, are a key part of that housing stock. 30 years ago, when I moved to Toronto, apparently I lived in an unlicensed rooming house. I just knew the people that rented the other rooms, all of us young, newly arrived in the city. My own grandmother ran a boarding house, it turns out, raising her sons there. And in fact, at one time, I heard on one of these historical walks through a neighborhood that a quarter of residential homes in Toronto were rooming houses. These were the places that many students, singles, and new arrivals in the city would land. And they're also often the only place which are affordable if you're on a low income, a place which keeps you off the street. For the past 15 years or so, Wood Green Community Services has been part of the Rooming House Emergency Relocation Program with partners such as Red Cross and the city's own Office of Emergency Management. It was developed in response to the fire at the Rupert on Parliament, and we continued to serve folks when such emergencies arose, 200 Wellesley being one of the biggest and most notable. However, over the course of the past 5 years or so, our staff are responding to a new form of displacement. When new development is planned, low-income tenants are often thrown out, and some often illegally, threatened, not knowing their protections under the landlord-tenant law. We have watched the disappearance of residential hotels, once common on city main streets. The names are familiar: the Waverly, Jags, Palace Arms, Drake, Gladstone, Maple Leaf Tavern, and New Broadview, once known as Jilly's. This stock, places where people could find a room and a bed, is disappearing. Half of the licensed rooming houses that were there 10 years ago are gone. The Parkdale Land Trust has carefully documented the rapid disappearance of rooming houses in their ward. And in fact now, through this relentless pressure for development, land assemblage and speculation, the city has been convinced even to look at a vacancy tax on empty units while we face a housing shortage in the city. In 2015, over the course of our own work at the New Broadview Hotel with streetcar development, Wood Green completed a study with housing expert Joy Connolly, which made many of the recommendations that are before you today, that where rooms were to be lost and tenants displaced, that the city had an interest in preventing that from happening, and those costs being displaced onto the public purse. TOcore's recommendations take an important step in the protection of tenants who are often the most vulnerable. Please move this forward. We don't need the extra work. Developers, in fact, tell us that they don't mind doing this, but that they want a regulation so that it's a fair playing field for all. Finally, a note how this section also ensures that city meets its goals in the age-friendly and Toronto senior strategy. The number of aging people that are marginally housed, seniors, has doubled in their last several reports that have been done as the entire population ages. Other seniors are looking forward to things such as co-housing, talked about eagerly in book clubs, how friends will move in together. This will provide some of the stability that this important housing stock provides. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions of the deputant? Okay, thank you very much for speaking today.
See you in a year.
Okay, questions of staff, are there any? Are you registered to speak, sir? That's fine, sir, come forward. You've got 5 minutes, and since you're not on the list, if you could kindly give us your name.
Yes. Thank you very much. My name is Paul Farrelly, and I am chair of the Community Preservation Panel of the Toronto East York that reports to the Toronto Preservation Board. I'm also involved in the local neighbourhood association, Church Wellesley, and I commend my colleague from Bay Clover Hills' letter, which is in your package, which Catherine Holden, took some time to look into TOcore. And it is really a daunting document for a community. Your usual reference point in your local neighbourhood, your cross streets, you zoom up 35,000 feet. And the granularity of the community is kind of lost somehow in this. You see park space. There's a new park space for Ryerson, but then the park space around U of T is not in one of the 20 maps. I think this next phase is vital, and it's vital to really get the community engagement end of the matter, because considering we're talking about 25 years, I'll be 90 in 25 years. I'll come back then and see how we got on. But really and truly, the major gap here is affordable housing. It's really not addressed in any kind of coherent way that is really, really important for the fabric of the existing neighbourhoods. Our neighbourhoods in Church Wellesley around there, you can see successive councils from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, decisions that created a co-op here or a co-op there, things that are vital in the fabric of the neighbourhood. And they hardly get a mention. As I say, it's not at a granularity level that you can really kind of deal with. And the biggest challenge we have in our communities is sort of applying it. What will it mean? And it's a phenomenal amount of people. You're talking about 500,000 people in a population that is now around 200,000. We've already had a 50%, or already planning a 50% increase in population. So given the window is so substantial, and there is some terrific language, there is, but any of us who go along to OMB hearings, there's a whole new portmanteau of language that isn't in other plans, and so it'll take time. So I do hope that the planning will come back to the communities, and that we can get a better sense of where we sit. Not to be parochial, but to raise up to your level and say, okay, this is the downtown. I have as much in common with somebody in King Spadina as I have in Church Wellesley. So it's a great bit of work, and may it continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? No, thank you very much. Were there any of the deputants added to the list, or are we done with deputants? Okay, so we bring it back to committee. We have questions of staff. Are there questions of staff from members of committee? I'm sure you have. So maybe for a minute, I just had a couple of quick questions. Sorry, the population 10 years ago, now, and projected.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the 1976 population was around 100,000. 2011, it was. I just got two numbers. I thought it was 199,000 in 2011. So more or less doubled in that planning period. And then since 2011, the pace of growth has been faster. So it's growing at about 7,500 a year. And right now we're at about 238,000.
And projected to go to?
Well, we use the words, carefully chosen words, potential projection is 475,000 in 2041. And I use those words carefully because there are so many variables, but the horizon is long enough that we need a robust perspective on how we plan for infrastructure over that period of time.
So then, Mr. DiGiorno, question. 70s, we had 100,000 people flushing. 2011, we had 200,000 people flushing. Now we've got almost 250,000 people flushing the toilets every day. And we're going to double that. Where are we at with the infrastructure? And in particular, the concern is the sewage in a combined sewage system that in times of ever increasing heavy rainfalls that we aren't even able to predict come up. How are we looking to deal with that? Because we don't want that overflow to end up out in our inner harbor or anywhere else where it can go back and start contaminating our beaches.
So the three key elements that need to be addressed from a Toronto Water perspective to try to address this kind of growth over the next 20, 30 years would be not just the sewers, but water mains as well. So what we have underway is a review of the water mains that are required for domestic use, as well as for firefighting downtown with large towers, make sure we have sufficient design water mains for fire service. Sanitary service, downtown it is a combined sewer, you're correct, so that will flow over to Ashbridges Bay. So we look then at the treatment side as well as the conveyance side, make sure we have enough capacity at the treatment plant to deal with that volume. And then the third component is the storm. We do have some storm sewers downtown at the road drainage level where we separated road drainage from the combined many years ago. So Toronto Water is completing reviews on all of those three components. We do have some concerns with pockets throughout the city with these densities that are being addressed. If I put it to you in the best description, when the city was originally designed, there was a lot of forethought of where the density might go, and traditionally that would have been north of Front Street. That's our traditional central business district, and in fact, in the 90s, the Two Kings followed that same path. And there are three large sewers that were put underneath the city, interceptors we call them, low level, mid Toronto, and high level. They all flow over to Ashbridges Bay for treatment. Where we're seeing some of the growth projected in future is actually below the Gardner and the railway tracks, where these types of densities that we're seeing right now, not only in TOcore, but in proposals that are coming forward, were never contemplated. And so you have a choice of, how do I take that flow and push it back up to those sewers? So you're looking at pumping stations to get it into the sewers over to the plant, or do I need another sewer south of the Gardner? And so that's being looked at by Toronto Water in a subsequent environmental assessment, and that's a waterfront master plan sanitary sewer plan, which is not only for that part of the city, but also the Portlands. Where there's a lot of work going on right now.
I don't want to run out of my own time. All right, I don't mean to cut you off.
Lots of work to do, is the point I'm making.
Are you looking at separating the sewer systems as we go forward?
So for the most part, the vast majority of the system has been separated from the road drainage system. There are a few locations in the downtown, very small areas, where that still needs to be done. So the short answer is yes. We're identifying those areas, and the strategy going forward will be to separate those. Another strategy coming out of our EA work is we need to tighten up the system. We're finding a lot of old infrastructure that's allowing more inflow and infiltration in the system than designed, we're going to have to clean that up as well. And the third component is the groundwater that's coming from a lot of these structures. They're going deeper into the ground, and they're hitting groundwater. And our choice is, what do we do with that groundwater? Do we just put it in the sewers? So have to build bigger sewer and infrastructure? Or do we do other things with it and preserve that sewer space for sanitary services, not groundwater?
And Greg, just a question. Different areas of the city, when you go around them, you don't have as many high-rises or as much density. You get to see the sky. Some of the areas in downtown, you don't even know where that might be. And you wait for that odd period of the day when the sun may appear somewhere between the buildings and bless you with this couple of rays of vitamin D, then disappear off to the other side of the building and be gone until the next day for that 15 minutes. How, and seeing the light and the sky is something that's really important to people, not being left in a cavernous city. How are you addressing that in this?
The path we've been on with intensification has obviously led to a lot of tall buildings in our centers and in the downtown. We've been guided when we plan for tall buildings. We've been guided for some years now by the tall building guidelines. And we have policies in the official plan that talk about the enjoyment of light view and privacy between buildings. We also worry about the impacts on the public realm, shadows on parks and shadows on sidewalks. So all of this adds up to an effort on our part to create space, as you indicate, for the benefit of the people that live in these buildings, but also for the benefit of the public in the public realm. We've taken steps already through the tower separation official plan amendment and zoning bylaw that council has adopted. It's under appeal at the OMB to convert the guidelines that we have for 25-meter separation into zoning. So we've taken the step that the industry often asks us to take, which is to put our guidelines into zoning if we really mean them, and we did that with the tower separation guideline. And part of that, as you indicate, was motivation to set a very balanced standard of allowing for, still allows for a lot of development permission, but does set a minimum standard to allow for light view and privacy between buildings and reduce the impact or mitigate the impact on the public realm.
Are there any other questions of staff? Are there any speakers to the item? I would, well, I would say, and I've had the opportunity a couple of times for staff to brief me on it, and I think our last speaker was right, extremely comprehensive, extremely going from a high level, trying to come down to a lower level, extremely difficult in particular with the fact that we adopt official plans, but they don't get it, but they get appealed. So I'm hoping as we go forward with this, we'll find a way to solve some of the appeals that are there and get support from this for the industry, so we can have a set of standards that people use when they go forward to build in the downtown, that people know what it is and have a platform to work from. As good or as good as we're trying to get it to be, at least it'll be something there to work from. And I think there's a lot of hard work that's gone into it, Greg, and I think you and your staff have done a great job so far. So do I have to move anything? I have a motion. I'm also, oh, I should add a motion, which I was asked to do on behalf of Councillor Cressy. The issue is the ability to retain space for expansion of our major health institutions. So this motion is here. I am tabling it on their request and their behalf. I think it's very important to do. And I know recently one site was the old Silverstein Bakery site right behind Mount Sinai. It was there for years. As I've said, the best rye bread that you've ever tasted. As I knew the family that used to run it. It changed to different parts of the family hands. They weren't interested in the bakery. They wanted the money out of the land. That's what they sold it for. Hospitals in the area that aren't able to buy more land because of the prices that we're seeing on it and the value that's being placed upon those lands. And some of it is not the value that staff would recommend based on the density that's there. It's this dream about what you can get out of it because the plans aren't all in place. And I think that my colleague, Councillor Cressy, is right. we have to do something. I'm a big supporter of that. I've heard the issue before, to try and make sure that we can maintain good lands in the area that we need, where we provide the hospital services around in the downtown. So that's why I'm more than happy to move the motion. So, motion, a vote on the amendment. All in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. The item is amended. I have another motion. Oh, I should have placed it. Sure, put it up. Oh. The first one is about stakeholder consultation, and staff have helped with both of these. And the water studies, which is the second one, which is how important. So, second item I'm moving. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. Item is amended. Those in favor, opposed, carried. Thank you all for your hard work on this. So, moving right along. We had a statutory item for 11 o'clock today, which we didn't meet, which is PG 22.9, the City Initiative St. Clair Avenue Study. With the committee's permission, I'd like to deal with that now. All those in favor, opposed, carried. We have a speaker on that.
He has not registered.
Well, and I understand you haven't registered, but you wanted to speak on it?
Yes,
So please tell us who you are.
a very brief statement.
Can I get, sorry, I need the mic on. There's a button in front of you.
There we go.
Okay, can I get a little order in the room? Okay, so you are?
My name is Jason DeLuca. I'm a planner for West Consulting. We're planning consultant for...
I got to get you to stop him. Hello? I got to hear the deputant. Please take it outside. You did great work, but talk about it outside so we can move on as well. Thank you. Sorry, your name again was?
My name is Jason DeLuca. I'm a planner at Wesson Consulting.
Yes.
We're the planning consultant for the registered owners of 1779 and 1791 St. Clair West Limited. They're the registered owners of the lands located on the south side of St. Clair between Ford Street and Osser Street. Just on behalf of our client, we just want to register our support for staff's recommended amendment to remove lands from zoning bylaw 569-2013 along St. Clair. We believe that this would help to facilitate the proposed development on the subject lands and also help to achieve the vision for as represented by the St. Clair Avenue study. We just would like to applaud staff for bringing this forward as quickly as they have. And that's it.
Well, thank you for sticking around. Any questions? Not seeing any. Any questions of staff? Councillor Barlow is moving the staff recommendations. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
You can tell at home you stayed, you waited, you talked to us, and you convinced us to go forward with it.
All right, thank you.
Okay. PG 22.6, status update, Heritage Register and Citywide Heritage Survey. We had a speaker for that. Eric McClelland. Is Eric here? Peter Margolian? Please come forward, Peter. You've been here for a while, you know, 5 minutes, we listen to you. If we have questions, we ask you, and then we'll go on from there.
Yeah, well, I basically just want to speak in favor of the Citywide Heritage Survey. I'm speaking just as a concerned citizen. I moved 3 years ago down to the downtown area, but my concern is simply that, it seems to me that, and I'm not pretending to speak as any sort of an expert, but I've lived in this city for 61 years, and one notices, just anecdotally, in moving around the city, that it seems that the city, probably as is obvious to most people, it's in a building or a heritage preservation crisis. So I'm very, very happy to see that the Citywide Heritage Survey, as proposed to my knowledge anyway, by Michael McClelland, is maybe correct me if I'm wrong about that, but I'm very happy to see that it's included in the agenda of today's meeting. You know, a heritage is of very obvious importance to a lot of people, and I would just like to point out that if you consider the downtown core report and recommendations, there's a lot of words and terms that very obviously, you know, point to, if you like, heritage concerns, like, for example, age-friendly and community complete community and culture. So it's very depressing for me anyway, as just an ordinary citizen, you know, in traveling about the city by bicycle as I do, to encounter all this plethora, you know, of all these big development application signs on the sides of buildings, and one superficially gets the sense, which I must say my attending today's meeting has helped to dispel, but you get a sense that it is out of control, you know, that the city, and as I was told by one member of a councillor's office, that the city can't handle the sheer number of development applications, so that a lot of them end up going directly to the Ontario Municipal Board rather than you know, the planners. So I'm very much encouraged by what I've learned by, just as an ordinary citizen, you know, attending today's meeting. Just to give you an example, one brief example, a couple of months ago, I happened to go through the intersection at Charles Street East and Church Street. Now, on the northwest corner of that intersection, there's an apartment building called the Manhattan Apartments. It was, I don't know, and I should have my statistics, it was probably built in the 1920s. Or around there. It's about a 3-story low-level apartment building. Very, very charming, really handsome. It's got a lot of character. It strikes me as being an architectural gem. Guess what? There's going to be, you know, a high-rise tower built on the property. The facade is going to be preserved. Now, at this point, there's probably nothing that can be done about it, but that's only one example of, I would say, you know, a failure to really preserve a property that would do an awful lot to enhance, you know, the tourist even attraction and livability of the city. Another brief example, on the southwest corner of Carlton Street and Church Street, there is a building, probably again from at least the 1920s, if not earlier. Now, it's not slated for development, it's simply up for sale. It's an obvious heritage building. You look at that building, and you look at that site, even though I would estimate, even though it's not presently slated for development, it's endangered. And given the location and the nature of that property, I would argue that it should be preserved. So anyway, I just want to, I'm here to speak in support of the, you know, the Citywide Heritage Survey. I'm not an expert. It may have its technical disadvantages, as has been brought up and discussed earlier, and that's fine, but it seems to me that the city should try to move as fast as possible to deal with this obvious crisis. It also, it seems to me...
Peter, I need you to wrap up.
Okay, yeah, I'll wrap it. It requires, you know, it may require, you know, the provincial participation to give the city the power it needs, but I would try to encourage everybody to support that proposal. Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions of the deputant? No questions. Thank you for coming, Peter. Thank you for staying around. Maria Fowler was on the list, but I think Maria's left. So I don't have any other speakers. Are there any questions of non-members of committee on this item of staff? Any questions of members of committee of staff? Any speakers? Councillor, go forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to begin by thanking our heritage staff for the work that they have done. I was one who criticized them many months ago, and I criticized them because in 2015, in February 2015, I moved a motion seconded by Councillor Wong Tam called Catching Up with the Past, Improving the City's Heritage Preservation Framework, that amongst a few ideas suggested that there be a proactive survey of the city and also look at examples such as Survey LA, which was cited in their report. 2 years later, nothing happened, and I was upset. I was upset also because, as was mentioned earlier in this meeting on the Midtown in Focus item, 2444 Yonge Street in Councillor Carmichael Greb's ward was lost. And once again, the community justifiably said, why aren't you being proactive? Why aren't you being proactive as a city to protect our cultural and architectural heritage? Councillor Shiner moved a motion also requesting a similar initiative to proactively survey our city. And I believe there were 2 or 3 other motions. What became very clear to me is that it wasn't just one councillor or another who was asking staff to do this. It was becoming the prevailing view of council that this was a priority. And I criticized staff for not acting on it sooner. What I did not understand is that quietly and diligently and tirelessly, heritage staff were working on ways to proactively preserve our heritage properties. The batch that you heard about earlier is one way, but they've been looking at ways and looking at best practices around the world, including Survey LA. So I want to acknowledge, first of all, preservation staff led by Merritt McDonald for their incredible work to be able to move forward with a strategy that they are hearing that it's a council priority, that reflects our priorities, that reflects the community's priorities, and doing it in a way where they have very few resources and they are doing so much. When we ask them to do work like this, we're not asking like a massive team of people with a big hotline network and many desks and a whole department to work on. We're talking about maybe 1 or 2 people doing a lot of this work. Human beings spending all their time doing this. And I can't fathom how they multitask all the demands that we put on their time, but they do. And so I want to say very publicly, my assumption was wrong. My frustration was real, because I wish that Toronto many decades ago would have done a better job of preserving heritage. I actually think Toronto in general has a shameful legacy when it comes to protecting our heritage, especially compared to cities like Boston and Quebec City and Montreal and cities throughout Europe and around the world. But what staff are moving forward with are ways to universally and proactively review our city in a way that, again, allows us to start taking the reins over what should be protected and what shouldn't be. What they are not doing is trying to sterilize the city. What they're not doing is trying to just say, let's just protect everything and figure it out later. What they are asking us to do, and we ask them to tell us how to do it, is finally, for the first time in an unprecedented way, start going out to more and more neighborhoods, to more and more streets, whether it be Midtown, whether it be Roncesvalles, whether it be throughout the city, and incrementally and try different ways to go out there and try to get a handle on what we've got out there. Because if we don't, by the time we get there, it may have been hit by a wrecking ball. We've seen that happen time and time again. I'll conclude, just the last thought. if we don't move forward with this proactive way of surveying our neighborhoods. And again, thank you to staff for actively listening to the motion that I moved and Councillor Shiner and others did too. If we don't do that, what we're going to find is that more and more developers will purchase these properties and be able to legally knock them down without any preservation at all, any listing at all, because they legally have the right to, and there will be nothing at that point that we can do to get in the way, to even take a pause to consider whether or not it's worthy of heritage protection in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other non-members wish to speak? Not seeing any members of committee want to speak. I have a motion to put up. Can staff put it up on the screen? The motion is to see if we can get students to actually come in earlier and do the work. It's simply a report to come back to us and inquire on that. We've done it so as to look at getting a team of student surveyors based on the approach and success of the annual Toronto Employment Survey, but I also understand it's been done in other jurisdictions. And the report now says leave it until consideration for the 2019 budget. Looking for staff to report back, give us an idea if it can work, what the cost might be, to see if we can fit it in sooner. So that's my motion. I think the work that we're doing and the importance of, we all know, I don't have to fill you in on how important it is to make sure that we do register the heritage buildings in the city properly. So my motion is an amendment. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. The recommendation of the report to receive it. Oh, we're done? Good. Okay, next item. Pardon me? How many deputations do we have for item 13? Well, we have next item number 11, which is the work plan end-to-end review, and we have 4 deps for item number 13. No, Councillor Menawong wanted to speak to it, so why don't we go, I don't know if there's a lot of speakers to it, but why don't we go to item 11, and then we'll go to our music people. Councillor Menawong, you wanted to speak to item number 11?
Yes, thank you. I don't think I've come to this committee in quite some time, but I was delighted to see this work plan, and I don't have to ask any questions because I did have a chat today with our chief transformation officer about this particular project. So I'm actually very pleased that this working group and this work will be chaired by the chief transformation officer. I think it has to be taken out of the planning process and out of the planning department so we have fresh eyes where there is no real interest to protect one's own, let's say, backyard and defend what's going on. So I'm pleased about that. The second thing I'm pleased about and was a concern to me was that, and there's a significant sum of money attached to this study, is that we're doing a qualitative analysis. So what I hear from the development industry is they pay large sums of money. Some developers pay over $1 million in application fees, and they can't get a phone call returned. That development applications are taking far too long. The service is not up to standard when hundreds of thousands of dollars are paid for the very service, and they cannot get the service that they would like, or actually, Mr. Chairman, the service that, quite frankly, they've paid for. I think there's a great unhappiness within the community that uses the planning department, and I can tell you that many of them are afraid to bring these issues up for fear of what might happen if they bring it up to their development applications. And so the qualitative aspect of this report will involve, within this project, going and speaking directly to the development community so we can ask them, what are the things that concern you? What are the problems that you've had? What are the phone calls that you haven't had returned? What's the right processing time? What type of service you should get? These are the things that we should be getting. This is the data that we should be getting. We've up to this point, talked about, looking at numbers. We have to look behind the numbers and make this process better because, quite frankly, the planning, the development process, our economy depends on it, and we have to actually service the industry to make sure that the economy continues on the way that it should.
Speakers from committee, Councillor Perks.
Thank you.
And I know Councillor DeCiano wanted to speak, Councillor Fillion wanted to speak as well.
Thank you. I'm going to shock you all and disagree with Councillor Min and Wong.
Imagine.
I'm actually not going to be supporting this report. There are a variety of myths that float around about the planning process. As a councillor, I don't deal with as many applications, say, as Councillor Fillion does, but I deal with a fair few. My experience is actually quite the opposite to what Councillor Min and Wong and certain people in the development industry claim to be the problem. Here's what typically happens. An applicant comes in with something well beyond what the official planning context or the mid-rise guidelines or the tall building guidelines call for. The planner says that doesn't meet what we want. We go out, we have a community meeting. The community agrees this does not meet what we want. And the planner tells the developer, you're going to have to make changes or I'm going to refuse the report. And then the developer disappears. It can be for 2 months, it can be for 6 months, it can be for 2 years. They sit on it, they go back to their finance guys, they phone the local counselor and say, can you give me a break? And then eventually we get them to bring in a slightly revised application. And the planner says, I'm glad you revised your main drawing. Did you do the transportation work for the new number of units? No, I didn't do that work. Have you looked at the Avenue segment study that we've asked you to do? No, I didn't update that work either. Have you done the work to look at the access and egress for your changed building and whether or not it meets our development standards? No, we didn't do that work. So the developer goes back and waits a little while longer and maybe hopes that the councillor will give them a break and we go through it all again. Because the applicant doesn't want to spend the money on the consultants he has on transportation, on the Avenue study, on the planning context, doesn't want to spend the money to have them do 2 or 3 iterations. So the problem isn't that our planning staff don't return phone calls. That's not the experience I've ever had. The problem is that the developer comes in with something that is overdeveloped and then doesn't want to spend the money to get the building into shape so that City Council can approve it. And they sit and do the calculation, which is cheaper. Me to do this in an iterative way to come into line with what the city zoning bylaws and official plan call for. Councillor Shiner is always talking about how we need to develop within our official plan. I can spend that money, or I can spend the money on a lawyer at the OMB, get my envelope, and then I'll spend the money on the fine detail work. Too often in the City of Toronto, there's a willingness to blame the City of Toronto and the public service for, frankly, developers who want to overdevelop and don't pay attention to the official plan and other planning documents that guide development in the City of Toronto. I think this is spending money to bring in people to look over the shoulders of a department that does fantastic work under enormous circumstances and with far too many critics who, including some on this council, who are all too happy to make it personal on the unbelievably dedicated public servants who deliver great value to the building industry and the City of Toronto and the residents of Toronto.
Yeah, thank you. I'll keep my comments brief. I actually agree with both what the Deputy Mayor stated and Councillor Perks stated. It's not either or, it's both, and we all know that. So that's just the facts. But with respect to the development review process, I'm really looking forward to the process being undertaken, but also coming back before a final report to the councillors who deal with development day in and day out, because I think there's a lot of insight to be had from those councillors that deal in wards very, very busy with development. I see it I didn't see it initially when I read the report. I just saw that the review was going to be undertaken by a bunch of departments, and I was concerned. But now, reading a little further, I do see that consultation will happen with councillors. Nothing more important than to make sure that happens, and I look forward to consulting with staff before a final report comes out on any potential new process. Thank you.
Councillor Fillion.
Thank you. I will support the recommendations moving ahead, but I do agree more with Councillor Perks than with Councillor Min Wong. You know, the developers usually are pretty good at getting what they want and having the expertise to do that. What I'm more and increasingly, you know, we get very few good applications. What I'm more concerned about is helping it with the ones that are easier to work with. They're sometimes also a bit less sophisticated about how to get something approved than the ones who are off to the OMB or threatening to go off to the OMB. So I would, you know, I do think we could do a better job at, for example, outlining right off the bat what someone is required to do. I recently had somebody who was just trying to build some townhouses on Bayview Avenue, and everybody was fine with the application. They didn't realize that they needed a severance, and didn't realize that till after they'd got their bylaw and are now being held up for several months. So if there'd been a checklist off the top saying, you know, here's everything you're supposed to do, make sure you do it. But most applicants are very well aware of what the checklist is, and often, you know, most of the complaints that I've had come to my office from applicants, it'll turn out that the fault isn't with the staff, it's with the applicant didn't provide something when they were supposed to, and then expects, you know, very quick turnaround after they've spent several months not providing what they were asked to provide. But I think we can always improve, and you know, this does also include interactions with the public, which I think we could do a better job at as well. So I think it's an exercise worth undertaking, so I'll vote to support it.
So I'll speak to it as well. The review of the planning process was initially a report that came here that the chief planner was going to do a review. And at committee, with the support of the committee members, I asked for it to go instead to the chief transformation officer, who was new, whose role was to work to find ways that the city can do its work better. And I think everyone here that's spoken so far is expressing opinions that we've all heard. Some blame staff, some blame the developer, everyone blames everyone else. The bottom line is, it is a very difficult process to take a development application through the city when you have up to 16 or sometimes more divisions reporting on it with different perspectives, and often they don't even agree amongst themselves how things should go forward. Our staff are probably the best that you're going to find anywhere, I would say, in Canada, and in particular, working under a jurisdiction that we have where we can say what we want, but we can't demand what we want because we don't have the final decision. We have that side street that all the developers can take an appeal, and then we're adjudicated elsewhere. No one else that I know of across the country has that kind of silly process, where the provincial government wants to maintain control of the development approvals but doesn't want to put their political hands into it, so they give it off to somebody else to deal with, and it doesn't work for both sides. So we have to find a way to do things better. Part of the reason to take it to the multiple divisions is we have such great staff, and they work now on the applications, and between them, they know themselves how to give us advice to make things better. That's why it's, in my opinion, best with a chief transformation officer. So whether it's Mr. DiGeronimo and his group, or the building department, or the transportation division, they have different ways of managing the applications. They have different standards, and some of them have key performance indicators that tell them how they're doing, and they're all different. And how do you really rate how you're doing in a planning report when you can have an applicant who slows it down, you can have a division that slows it down, you can have a community that slows it down, or people that don't respond, or something that's ridiculous, or something that's an application that's fantastic. One in Councillor Cressy's ward, Heritage Building we've talked about, 505 Richmond. It went outside of the box, where we had the applicant, because it was working with Bill Toronto, meet with the city staff in a couple of meetings at the beginning with Mr. Lintern and his crew. They were all working on it and start to work through the process, and they spent a year pre-application review, sorting out most of the problems. So I said after to Greg, once they put it in, how long after they make their application can you have this approved? And Greg said to me, 9 months. And in 6 months, it showed up at council to be considered. So it means that sometimes if we work a little differently with the cooperation of the applicants, which is necessary, because if they don't cooperate, you can't, and with the cooperation of our staff, who are not all great trained facilitators and able to manage the different divisions to coax the work out of them or get it there. Let's be realistic about it. We can get a better process, but everybody's complaining. The applicants are complaining, the community's complaining, councillors are complaining that the process needs fixing, and I think we all agree that the process needs to be looked at to find a better way to deal with it all. But I agree that we have great people, most of them that want to see it work, and we have some great developers that want to see it work. And even now, an application comes in and the process is a little different, as I understand it. An application is taken and the staff in the district sit down, they look at the application, they try and say whether it's good, medium, or really bad, and try and give a quick response if they have to refuse it, or start to work with the applicant. That's great. I've asked the question, once you've done that, why don't you call the applicant in? Sit down with them and tell them the same thing that you've seen, to have a chance to see where the application is going at the beginning of the process, before they start to invest all the money that's been talked about in doing all these plans. And once they start to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in consultant report, they start to solidify their opinion and don't really want to move it. And that's when some of them pull the trigger and want to go outside to the board, which they're allowed to do. So I think we have an opportunity here to look at it in a greater perspective with what I, again, am saying is the greatest team that you may have, dealing with development applications in Canada and under a regime that we have, and find ways to do it better. And we're really leaving it with our Chief Transformation Officer that was here less than a week before he heard he's going to have to work on a plan like this. But I think, from my understanding with city staff and talking with Mr. Livy, it's something that they're embracing. It's something I think they can do. It's something they can show us they can do, and I really challenge them all to find the way to give us the best suggestions that you can to do the work in the best way you can, because you know it, and tell us what you need, and then we'll try to support it from there as best as we can. So I'm hoping that we do all support this, and it goes through council, and we do find something better on it. And I look for Councillor Perks to change his mind by the time it comes to council. I am going to simply move the staff recommendations and ask for the vote. All those in favor? All those opposed? It's carried. Hopefully we won't have a long debate and the greater support of council. And I look forward to the communication the staff will have and the work between the divisions and the communications with members of council, who I think may be able to help you along the way as well. We have one item left. It's the music item. We can sing to that for our last item. Balancing music venues and new development. We have 4 speakers. Kathy McDonald. Kathy's still here. Then Harold Smith, Amy Terrell, and Spencer Sutherland.
It all came so fast.
Well, we're listening. If he shows up, that's fine.
Yep.
It was the last item
Sorry
on
about
the
that.
agenda now, and or unfortunately, we're dealing with it this afternoon instead of this morning. We appreciate your patience. So you get 5 minutes. We're here to listen to you. If there's questions, we'll ask them.
Okay. So my name is Kathy McDonald. I've submitted a letter that you should have copies of. I'm here on behalf of the Toronto Noise Coalition, a group that was formed of residents and residents associations last spring in response to concerns about the kind of noise bylaw that was being proposed and by MLS. And we have subsequently been part of a working committee with MLS and the various interests in the noise bylaw ever since. And on the September 27th, we're going to have a meeting on the sort of conclusions. So we have several serious concerns about this proposal. First, it's not about balancing the rights of the music industry and the needs of development. That's the tail wagging the dog. The city must meet many needs, not just of one sector. The interest of the music sector should be like any private business, with opportunities to dispute regarding development applications. We don't understand why they should be treated differently. The rationale for a new process for economic development reporting on development applications appears to come from the concern that concert venues are being pushed out. And what they're being pushed out because of complaints made about the impacts of some of the facilities. Many, of course, like Roy Thompson Hall, are no problem. There's really no connection to doing anything about development applications, as far as I can see. What will really stop this pushback of against some of these concert venues is their lack of compliance with noise bylaws that adequately protect the quality of life of residents. And this bylaw, current bylaw, has to be strengthened to do it better. They're not in locations that are appropriate, and further, that the venues are not working with nearby residents to help resolve issues. The proposed criteria in the report really don't make any sense to me for consideration in the economic development's reporting. Perhaps the sort of noise or protection, strengthening of windows and things like that may be important, but the developers could do that in any case. They make two suggestions. One about crowd mitigation, and surely that's the responsibility of the venue operator. And in the process of the noise bylaw working group, we've heard from venue operators that certainly do this and are very successful. The second is the idea, well, if you tell new residents that there's a concert venue next door, they'll be happy. I'm sure they won't be as soon as they're disturbed by any disruption, undue disruption from the venue. Sort of finally, I would just say that we really need to have a different approach of dealing with the issues that are raised by concert venues and where they're causing problems. The first, we really need city leadership to advocate for a livable city, particularly in the development of this new noise bylaw that we're working on that's going to be coming out in the next few months. One that is based on the premise that there should be quality of life for residents of the city. Planning policies are also important, also, as I said before, effective communication to resolve issues between the venues and the neighbors.
Can I need to get you to sum up?
That's it.
Well, thank you.
That's my conclusion. Thank you.
And my request was at the perfect time. Are there any questions of the deputant? Not seeing any. Thank you very much for sticking around. Now, Harold, you said isn't here?
No.
Okay. I've got Amy Terrell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, councillors. Mic's on? Excellent.
Yep.
So thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to speak today. I work for Music Canada, but I'm also a member of the Toronto Music Advisory Council. And I'm also working closely on Regional Advisory Council for our National Live Music Association, which is called Music Canada Live. It creates a lot of confusion. I'm sorry about that. That our names are so similar, but and that Regional Advisory Council is looking at the importance of venues in Toronto and how we ensure sustainability for live music venues. I'm speaking in support of this motion, which I feel the theme really here is about being proactive and preventing conflicts that might arise between different land uses, between residents and live music venues. Toronto is certainly not alone in addressing this issue. And conflicts, it is true. I mean, what our previous deputant said, that conflicts can arise between residents and venues, and therefore being more proactive and proper planning will help to address that. Often what we see is that new developments are attracted to an area, a vibrant part of the city. Often music is part of that. Residents are attracted there as well, but without proper planning, as I said, conflicts can arise. We can look to cities like London, UK, Melbourne, Australia, New York City, San Francisco, Austin, Berlin, many cities that are addressing this issue in a very proactive manner. The city that has policy that most closely resembles this is San Francisco, their nightlife legislation, which has created a process very similar to this, where development applications go before the Entertainment Commission, and it encourages cooperation and compromise between the development community and the venues, so you create good neighbors. Very specific examples, things like developments that are planned where either the entrance to the development is going to put that in conflict with crowds coming out of the venue, could be the sound mitigation measures of the new development, or even where the windows face exactly, for instance. So there can be very specific efforts to mitigate conflict. Jocelyn Kane from the Entertainment Commission in San Francisco has been in Toronto and has, I know, met with some members of council and provided some insights. New York City has been used as an example of a place that has a very sound good noise bylaw, but in fact, they just recently announced that they are establishing a nightlife commission and advisory council because they've actually lost 20% of their small venues over the last 15 years. In Toronto, as we know, there have been some headlines about venues that have closed here for a variety of reasons, not always because of conflicts with new developments, and that goes to say that this is not the only measure that is going to ensure sustainability of a night life or a music scene here in Toronto. There are many other things that have to be done. The noise bylaw process that is underway is very important, and it will be important that there are clear, transparent, consistent bylaw and enforcement, but many other measures that have been recommended by the Toronto Music Advisory Council. Ultimately, I think we all want a livable city that is vibrant and balances the residential and non-residential needs, and this is certainly a way to achieve that. Music, as you probably all know, helps to attract young people and the businesses that employ them, and it's part of a vibrant city like Toronto. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks.
Thank you. Are there any questions? I think you covered things very well. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I have Spencer Sutherland.
Hello, thank you for letting me speak today, Chair and Council. My name is Spencer Sutherland. I'm with the Queen Street West Business Improvement Area, a longstanding board member of TABIA, and also a member of the Toronto Music Advisory Council. I speak in support of Councillor Cole's motion today, which is consistent with the approach taken in many other world-leading cities that have already been mentioned by my colleague Amy Terrell, which have adopted planning policies to support and protect music venues and give consideration to the nighttime economy in our fast-growing city in order to ensure vibrancy in the downtown core, and that we be careful not to sterilize it in the process. This motion is important because, in part, we don't have, in the provincial building standards, there are no requirements for noise insulation or any consideration for the intensity of mixed land uses that we experience here in Toronto. And that's why we feel that it is important to bring entertainment and music into that discussion, into that planning discussion, in order that development proposals that are close to cultural music venues may be given the consideration, the placement of windows, the quality of build standard, the noise insulation, et cetera, in order to proactively prevent conflicts that otherwise are going to be inevitable. And if we deal with these things ahead of time, we are in fact protecting both the businesses and the residents in this fast-growing city. Toronto is one of the fastest-growing cities in the world. For every person that moves into the downtown core, 2 jobs are created. A lot of what attracts the people living in the core now, livability means different things to different people. Quality of life means different things to different people. And many people are attracted to the rich cultural offerings in the city. And if we grow too fast and we eliminate those, then we end up with a sterile core, and I think that that's something we would all wish to avoid. This motion, I don't think, does anything except to incorporate entertainment use into the discussion of planning and developments, and I think that there are no downsides to that. I would also like to recommend for this motion to perhaps give some attention to the heritage conservation districts that we have in the city. Queen Street West, that I represent, is one of them, where we do have many of our smaller grassroots music venues that experience many conflicts as taller developments grow up around them. The protection of the heritage in those areas we feel is important. Music is an important part of the culture in those areas, and we would hope that that be taken into consideration as development proposals are considered. And that, I think, is all I have to say today. So thank you for hearing my support for this motion.
Well, thank you very much for having the patience to stick around and listen to everything else we did to give us your thoughts. It's appreciated. Are there any questions of the deputant? Thank you very much again. So then we have no non-committee members. We have committee members. I'm more than happy to move the motion with a small change, I was told, because it was referred to us by council as a city council request, and I'm told to change it Planning and Growth Committee request. That is my big amendment. I will move it. All those in favor? Oh, did you want to speak to it? Oh, go ahead. I'll just move my amendment and speak to my support for it.
As Spencer said, there are many aspects to quality of life, and sometimes quality of life means finding a nice quiet place, and sometimes it means listening to music and or experiencing the other arts. And Toronto is losing music venues, but the purpose of this, and I'm saying this, I guess, partly for the benefit of the first speaker, is to try to eliminate conflict, and preferably to eliminate conflict before it exists. So if you have an existing music venue and somebody's planning to build a condo across the street, you want to make sure that there's noise mitigation measures either in the new condo or perhaps paid for by the developer in the music venue across the street. But what we're trying to do is be able to have people enjoy quiet, but also keep a thriving, keep our music venues thriving, and it's others have said it, but it's really important to the life of a city to make sure that we have that, and it does require work, and this is totally some of the work that needs to happen.
Okay. No other speakers? The motion as I amended it, all in favor? Opposed? That's carried. We stand adjourned. Thank you all for sticking around.
Okay, so just a few minutes?
Yeah.